The Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. This morning, we welcome EPA Administrator Wheeler. Welcome, Administrator. We welcome you back to the subcommittee to examine the President's budget request for fiscal year 2021. This year's budget should be familiar to members of the subcommittee. Once again, the President has proposed significant cuts, this time 26% below last year's enacted levels. If enacted, I fear this funding level will jeopardize the agency's ability to fulfill its mission of protecting Americans' health and our environment, and I'm certain that the House will reject this request. Even in areas that the administration has singled out as priorities, there are drastic cuts. The drinking water SRF, for example, was proposed to be reduced by over $260 million, despite the agency's most recent needs assessment finding that the amount of needed capital investment only continues to grow. By contrast, the majority's infrastructure plan recognizes this need and proposes significantly increased funding for our nation's drinking water systems. For the Superfund, another one of administration's priorities was reduced by more than $110 million, despite EPA facing the biggest backlog of unfunded projects in 15 years. I'm also concerned that the request includes a proposed 11% reduction to EPA staff, which is already operating at low levels. There are significant numbers of experienced and dedicated employees leaving or retiring, taking their institutional knowledge along with them, and they are not being replaced at the same rate. In addition to the budget, members of the subcommittee will be interested in receiving updates on EPA's regulatory agenda. I believe many of us are concerned that EPA is not acting urgently or comprehensively enough to address serious risks to Americans' drinking water. Last year, EPA issued its long-term revision of the lead and copper rule, which in my opinion falls short of what is necessary to reduce the threat of lead in our drinking water. And last week, EPA made a proposed regulatory determination for PFOA and PFAS. We are still months away from a final regulatory determination. And if experience with perchlorate has taught us anything, we may be waiting a long time before we see any finalized standard, let alone a standard that is protective of our vulnerable populations. Finally, I'm extremely concerned by the political leadership's continued treatment of scientific expertise within the agency and outside advisors. I want to highlight a story in the Washington Post from December entitled EPA's Scientific Advisors Warn Its Regulatory Rollbacks Clash with Established Science. EPA's Science Advisory Board, which includes many appointees by this administration, has raised concerns and objections that several of the most significant proposed rollbacks of environmental protections are at odds with the scientific record, and proposed process changes may have long-term detrimental impacts on the agency. For example, the board's draft review of the Science Transparency Rule stated that if, and I quote, could easily undercut the integrity of environmental laws, as it will allow systematic bias to be introduced with no easy remedy, close quote. A memo from the administration to board members this week raises further concerns about the administration's efforts to sideline independent scientific review of its work. It is critical that our public health protections be grounded in robust science, and sadly, I believe the administration continues to dismiss science and expertise whenever it conflicts with its deregulatory agenda. Mr. Wheeler, I thank you again for joining us this morning, and I look forward to today's discussion. With that, the chair now recognizes Mr. Shimkus, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Representative Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, I have a present for you, something that you've asked for many years. Here's your personal copy of a Shimkus for Congress T-shirt.
Thank you.
And your personal copy of a Shimkus for Congress bumper sticker.
I have to tell you, one of the chambers of commerce in my district is headed by a Mr. Shimkus. Same exact spelling, and I will make certain he sees these. And I tell him they're probably brothers somehow or cousins, but much appreciated, Mr. Shimkus.
You're welcome. Lithuanian heritage, so those who want to know where the ethnicity comes from. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me for an opening statement about today's subcommittee hearing on the President's proposed budget for the Environmental Protection Agency in fiscal year 2021. I want to join you in welcoming Administrator Wheeler back to the Committee on Energy and Commerce. It is good to have the agency here to answer for itself on policy calls and budget recommendations made in the President's budget. Let's remember, though, that this proposed budget, actually any President's budget, is not binding on anything Congress ultimately decides to do. In my over 2 decades here, I have yet to see a Congress copy a President's budget and pass it as it was sent to us. During my first EPA budget hearing as ranking member of the subcommittee back in 2007, the run-up to the hearing was littered with press statements about how the Bush EPA didn't care about the environment because it didn't propose the level of funding its political opponents desired. I noted then, and I note now, that the Beatles had it correctly. Money can't buy you love, and it's not certainly a guarantee of an improving environment. There are lots of worthy ideas and programs that EPA could address, but does it make the most sense to have an EPA be the one to do it every time? We should not advocate for more funding if all it is buying is bureaucracy, regulatory confusion with other agencies, or programs that don't really improve public health or the environment, but take funding from ones that do. I've said it before, but I believe it bears repeating. We need to not only know how American tax dollars are being spent, but are Americans getting a better quality of life for the return on their investment? At a macro level, the indicators are that our environment is in much better shape than it was when the agency first opened its doors for business. Trends in air, water, and soil pollution are positive. For example, before 1970, EPA reported 40% of our nation's drinking water systems failed to meet basic health standards. Today, EPA says 92% of Americans receive potable water from water utilities that meet all health-based standards. In terms of air quality, between 1970 and 2018, the combined emissions of 6 common pollutants, including particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and sulfur dioxide, dropped by 74% in the United States. The air we are breathing today is cleaner than when the agency opened its doors 5 decades ago. At a micro level, between newer and more powerful detection equipment, emerging questions about toxicity, and an aging workforce at EPA, nagging questions and new challenges pit resources and long-term priorities against each other. As the Environmental Protection Agency is in the process of celebrating its 50th year of operation, serious questions need important thought to help transition from an EPA geared for previous generations to one prepared to meet future ones. I am pleased this administration has deployed objective metrics to better access deliverables. I hope to explore this area during my questions, and I hope the answers demonstrate an agency geared towards following the law and delivering results. Before I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman, I do want to congratulate Administrator Wheeler for some of his recent actions to provide Americans safe drinking water, the issuance of a proposed update to the lead and copper rule, and preliminary determinations to regulate PFOA and PFAS. These are significant developments that have been anticipated for quite some time. I applaud you for recognizing that access to safe drinking water is an important environmental threat and being the one to stand up and act. Again, welcome, Administrator Wheeler. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Pallone, chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. I thank Administrator Wheeler for being here today, but I'm not happy with what the EPA is doing. Last year, 4 former EPA administrators testified before our committee criticizing this EPA for failing to meet its essential life-saving mission. Christine Todd Whitman, a Republican former administrator and New Jersey governor, testified, and I quote, that the EPA currently on the track that it's on is endangering public health and the health of the environment. And I agree with Governor Whitman's assessment. Instead of protecting public health and the environment, this EPA is putting them at greater risk. And former Administrator Gina McCarthy said at the hearing that EPA's political leadership needs to, and I quote, step up and do their jobs. Unfortunately, it's clear with this budget request that EPA's political leadership is continuing on this dangerous track. We're at a critical time for environmental protection. The impacts of climate change are already here, affecting communities across the nation and the world. PFAS and other emerging contaminants are showing up in our drinking water, air, and soil. Our water infrastructure is crumbling, and too many communities are struggling with lead contamination. And we can't afford to ignore these threats, but that is exactly what the Trump EPA's budget request does. At a time when the backlog for Superfund cleanups is the longest it's ever been, we can't afford to cut Superfund funding. Yet this budget would cut it by $112 million. When communities are struggling to get lead out of their drinking water, we can't afford to cut assistance for the drinking water state revolving funds. But this budget would cut that funding by $262 million. When sea level rise and toxic red tides threaten coastal communities, we can't afford to cut beach grants, but this budget would eliminate them entirely. And when PFAS contamination is being discovered in more communities all the time, we can't afford to gut the research funding or EPA staff working to develop solutions, but nevertheless, this budget would slash science and technology funding, toxic risk reviews, and drinking water programs. These cuts, like so much of what we've seen from this EPA, would harm public health and the environment, just as the former administrators predicted. But fortunately, Congress holds the power to decide how much funding these important programs will actually receive, and will work to protect these programs and the communities they serve. I think a budget speaks to the priorities of the administration proposing it. This Trump administration is clearly shouting that it doesn't care about safe drinking water. It has no interest in protecting people from toxic chemicals in their products or their water. It feels no urgency to keep PFAS out of our air, land, water, or bodies, and it has no intention of dealing with the climate crisis. And this budget proposal simply does not allow the EPA to fulfill its mission to the American people, and therefore it is a proposal that we have to reject. We simply cannot follow the dangerous course this administration is trying to take us down. Instead, House Democrats are taking action to protect public health for vulnerable populations, for environmental justice communities, and for future generations. With the Clean Future Act, my colleagues and I have outlined aggressive action to address climate change and other pollution. With the Lift America Act and the Moving Forward framework, we've offered infrastructure solutions that invest in protecting public health while also strengthening our economy and creating good-paying jobs. And with the PFAS Action Act, we've set a course to eliminate the threat of PFAS chemicals. Instead of weakening coal ash regulations, we would strengthen them. Instead of weakening vehicle emission standards, we would strengthen those. And instead of leaving lead service lines in the ground, we would speed replacements. Instead of wasting time on unnecessary red tape before setting a drinking water standard for PFAS, we would require a protective standard quickly. And I think this is a better path forward to combating climate change and protecting public health and the environment. So in closing, I return to the testimony of former Republican Administrator Whitman, who stated last year that she was, and I quote, deeply concerned that 5 decades of environmental progress are at risk because of the attitude and approach of the current administration. And I just share that concern. Like so much of what we've seen from the Trump administration, this budget would put the climate, our air, our drinking water, our land, our communities, and our planet at greater risk. And this is not a path that we can afford to go down, Mr. Chairman. So again, I thank the administrator for being here. Look forward to the testimony and questions, and thank you, Chairman Tonko. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his
All right,
opening
Mr. Chairman.
Please, good morning.
Good morning, and Mr. Administrator Wheeler, thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you're doing. You know, I have to just say, I mean, listen to my friend on the other side of the aisle. At least the administration has put forward a budget each year. That's better than this majority has done that didn't even do a budget last year. But anyway, we're here to hear about your budget, your proposals, and your accomplishments. We're here to listen to you talk about how you follow the law at the EPA and the mandates of Congress. And we share a concern about cleaning up our water and making sure we have clean air. But we also want those decisions based on science and scientific evidence and fact. And I know, especially when it comes to PFAS, PFOA, these issues you're dealing with, you're following the law and trying to get to the science, and we appreciate that. EPA has developed a strong record of success over the 50 years it's been in operation. An agency, I believe, was created under Richard Nixon, a Republican, as I might note. According to EPA's most recent numbers, from 2016 to 2018, all criteria air pollutants continued to decrease. Adding to long-term positive trends, the air is substantially cleaner and clearer. Similar improvements have been accomplished in the nation's drinking water systems. In this committee, we've worked together in a bipartisan way in the last Congress to deal with some of these issues, to clean up and modernize brownfields and the Brownfields program, to work on Safe Drinking Water Act and grants to our communities. We examined in a hearing just 2 weeks ago, the agency is actively working to strengthen and accelerate removal of lead lines from water systems. And today, fully 93% of the nation's drinking water systems meet all health-based standards all the time. Now, that's up from 60% of the systems 50 years ago, but we know more work needs to be done, and we'll look forward to hearing about EPA's progress in this area. We'll talk today about progress to return polluted land to beneficial use, one of the priorities of this committee over the last 2 Congresses. I understand, for example, that the agency has made substantial strides cleaning up Superfund sites so that more communities can work to produce economic opportunity and jobs on those sites. On this point, I'm pleased to see the Administrator is continuing to emphasize the Portland Harbor cleanup. You and your predecessor did what the last administration was not doing, which is moving forward rapidly to get the Willamette River and the harbor cleaned up in an economic way and in an effective way for the environment. That's something all Oregonians applaud. And concerning the Brownfields program, another committee priority, it's encouraging to learn the EPA has been surpassing its goals for returning land to good economic use, making some 1,770 sites ready for anticipated use over the past 2 years. Now, while there continue to be many environmental risks and regulatory challenges to address, we'll also talk today about those, and we recognize the environmental economic improvements are continuing against the backdrop of the current administration's broader economic policies. Economic data show how the administration's pro-worker policies have contributed to healthy economic growth, increased household incomes, record low unemployment, especially among the middle and lower income classes, and a reinvigorated manufacturing and industry. Much of this economic good news has occurred because of sound tax policy, the tremendous benefits of our energy revolution, removal of regulatory unnecessary barriers to economic initiative, and a focus on what's in the best interest of the American consumer. It should be clear that environmental progress should not be an impediment to economic growth. It doesn't have to be. They can go hand in hand. Indeed, the example of improving environmental metrics and the EPA's priorities to reuse formerly contaminated sites to create opportunity zones for underserved communities underscores how environmental improvements can create new economic opportunities. However, we should not fall for deceptive arguments that a history of economic growth justifies more environmental regulation. This ignores the lost economic opportunities of regulatory costs and delay, which do not show up in GDP reports. Instead, as this administration's been doing, we should recognize the economic potential and additional environmental benefits of updated, more streamlined regulations and more efficient EPA permitting and environmental guidance. This lends more certainty to development decisions, more effective decisions by states and localities. So for years, I've heard from farmers and ranchers across Oregon about the last administration's overreaching definitions on waters of the U.S., and I applaud this administration for getting it right with the rule, and I appreciate the work that's being done to modernize NEPA as well. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back so we can hear from our distinguished witness and get to our questions.
The gentleman yields back, and we thank you. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. I now will introduce the witness for today's hearing, that being the Honorable Andrew Wheeler, Administrator of our United States Environmental Protection Agency. Before we begin, I would like to explain the lighting system. In front of you are a series of lights. The light will initially be green. The light administrator will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. Please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point, and the light will turn red when your time has indeed expired. I now recognize Administrator Wheeler for 5 minutes to provide an opening statement, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, Ranking Member Walden, Chairman Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. Joining me today to discuss EPA's proposed 2021 budget request are David Bloom, EPA's Acting Chief Financial Officer, and Brittany Boland, Associate Administrator of EPA's Office of Policy. The year 2020 marks the 50th anniversary of the creation of EPA, and I think we can all agree on how far we've come over that time. Today, the U.S. is a global leader with respect to clean air and access to safe drinking water and we are currently cleaning up contaminated lands at the fastest pace in over a decade. Recently, we released the 2019 Year in Review, highlighting agency accomplishments and environmental progress under President Trump. I encourage everyone to read the full report, and I'd like to ask that this report be entered into the record. Thank you.
So approved, I believe, yes.
The Trump administration is proving that environmental protection and historic economic growth can go hand in hand. Because we know that environmental issues disproportionately impact children and low-income and minority communities, we are taking strong actions to protect these populations. Through the Federal Lead Action Plan and new cross-cutting lead in healthy schools initiatives, EPA will continue coordinating with our partners to reduce childhood lead exposure and protect the most vulnerable among us. For the first time in nearly 20 years, EPA issued new, tighter standards for lead dust in homes and child care facilities across the country. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, EPA proposed a revision to the lead and copper rule. This rule would ensure water systems have plans in place to rapidly respond to reduce elevated levels of lead in drinking water, and will focus work on the most impacted areas of the country. The budget request also includes additional resources to implement the PFAS action plan to address these emerging chemicals of concern. Last week, EPA proposed regulatory determinations for PFOA and PFAS in drinking water, and also proposed to close the loophole that allows new uses of products that include PFAS chemicals to be imported into our country. These, along with previous EPA actions, mark key milestones in EPA's extensive efforts to implement the PFAS action plan. To assist states in rebuilding aging water infrastructure, the budget request includes $2 billion to continue to utilize the 2 state revolving funds. For every federal dollar contributed to date, communities have received over $3 of water infrastructure investments in return. Additionally, the $25 million for our WIFIA program is expected to deliver more than $2 billion in direct credit assistance, spurring over $4 billion in total infrastructure investments. To safeguard the Americans' water supply, today we are releasing our National Water Reuse Action Plan, the first initiative of this magnitude coordinated across our water sector to accelerate and improve water recycling and security. 80% of states anticipate some freshwater shortages within the next decade, and this plan will help all levels of government ensure Americans have access to clean, safe water for generations to come. When it comes to reducing air pollution, the agency is both improving the state implementation plan process and reducing the SIP backlog. EPA has redesignated 36 areas around the country into attainment, lifting major regulatory burdens off local communities and ensuring clean air for those communities. In 2019, EPA acted on over 360 SIPs, 165 of which were backlogged. And just last week, Florida's final non-attainment area reached attainment, putting the entire state into compliance with the Clean Air Act. These achievements not only improve public health, but also support greater economic growth, both of which are priorities for President Trump. When it comes to enforcing the nation's environmental laws, EPA is significantly increasing compliance. In 2019, we received voluntary disclosures at over 1,900 facilities, more than double the number in 2016. And the agency is also deterring noncompliance by stepping up criminal cases, which have increased in all tracked categories for the first time since 2011. Administrative, civil, and criminal fines were among the highest in the last decade, totaling over $470 million. Finally, EPA is cleaning up some of the nation's largest, most complex contaminated sites, returning them to productive use. In 2019, we deleted 27 Superfund sites from the national priorities list, the most number deleted since 2001. Our budget request also provides nearly $130 million for brownfields work, including $18 million specifically for opportunity zones, and which will spur greater investment in economically distressed areas. Last year, EPA selected 149 communities to receive brownfields grants. 108 of those were in opportunity zones in both inner cities and rural communities. As EPA celebrates its 50th anniversary, we can proudly say that Americans today have significantly cleaner air, land, and water, and we are continuing this progress in ensuring all Americans, no matter where they live, can share in it. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Administrator, for your opening statement. We now will move to member questions. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Administrator, you mentioned the 50-year history of EPA. There is no question there has been a lot of progress in environmental protection during this time. But today you'll hear from members that there are a lot of old challenges remaining, like Superfund cleanups and new ones emerging like PFAS. I know you recognize this because you were once an employee, but I believe continued progress will demand years of work on major actions and the expertise of long-tenured staff. So my question to you is, do you believe this budget prepares our nation to deal with the environmental and public health threats that we can expect during the next 50 years?
Sorry. Yes, I do. And we are returning to the basics of the agency, focusing on air, land, and water. On the Superfund program, we cleaned up more sites last year than any year since 2001, and we're also increasing enforcement actions against responsible parties. We increased the number of funds recovered last year to reimburse EPA for cleanup. So it's not just the amount of money we receive through the appropriations process that cleans up Superfund sites, but it's the money that we go after responsible parties, and that number increased last year over the previous years as well.
But in the bigger picture, I really believe that we, as an agency, EPA needs time, it needs quality staff, qualified staff, and science. And hollowing out the agency will have long-term ramifications.
Right now, as of today, 40% of our workforce is eligible to retire. That's why I hired a new human resources director last year. I actually interviewed the candidate for the human resources position, which is 3 or 4 levels below me. I was told that administrators never interview human resource directors. I wanted to make sure we got the hiring right for the EPA of the future. Last year, we hired 1,000 new employees. We are stepping up our hiring of professionals. We're stepping up our hiring of scientists. But it is difficult to attract qualified people to get through the entire
Okay, Mr. Administrator, I'd like to move on. Sure. Is it fair to say that the agency's role in addressing climate change is not a priority in this budget?
No, we're moving forward on climate change as well. That's why we finalized our ACE rule last summer, which will show 34% reduction in CO2 from 2005 levels from the utility sector. We're moving forward with our CAFE standards, which will continue to show CO2 reductions from cars, while we're working on methane, even while we're working on food waste.
Well, we went through your testimony as well as the 124 pages of EPA's budget in brief. There are essentially 0 mentions of the words climate change or carbon dioxide. The only references we could find were in the section about eliminated programs, which include the Atmospheric Protection Program and the Global Change Research Program. Otherwise, there is just a single mention of methane as a potent greenhouse gas in the context of reducing food waste in landfills, which is far from the level of leadership necessary from EPA to reduce climate pollution.
Well, I think our actions speak louder than the words in the budget, and we are reducing CO2 through ACE, through CAFE, through our methane regulations, and also our food waste program.
Well, is it doing that at the pace that the scientific community says is necessary? Or even less ambitious than that, at the pace to achieve the United States commitments under the Paris Agreement?
President Trump has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, and we are utilizing the laws that Congress has passed, and our regulations follow the laws that Congress has passed, unlike the Clean Power Plan of the Obama administration, which was stayed by the Supreme Court.
Well, excluding climate from the budget, eliminating research and voluntary industry partnership programs, and weakening modest existing rules, which has happened, does not give me any indication that the agency is taking this environmental threat seriously. Mr. Administrator, in your written testimony, you said, and I quote, "It is more important than ever we send the message to the public that when they encounter environmental threats, we will address them head on. And we want the world to know that when they encounter environmental threats, we are ready to help." Close quote. Do you think the public is receiving the message that the EPA is addressing greenhouse gas pollution head on?
I do. As when we wrote out our ACE rule last summer, we readdressed climate change through the ACE rule. We're also addressing it through the other regulations I've already mentioned. But again, we are using the laws that Congress has passed. Congress has not passed any new additional laws to address climate change.
Do you think
we
the
are
world
working
believes
within the boundaries of the laws that Congress has given us to implement regulations,
Do you
follow the 4 corners of the law?
Do you think the world believes the United States is prepared to do its part in a global response to climate change?
We take climate change seriously, and we're implementing the laws that Congress gave us. The U.S. is a global leader in clean air progress, including the traditional criteria pollutants, like particulate matter and ground-level ozone.
Mr. Administrator, with all due respect, I don't understand how you could possibly make a statement like that after the administration's complete abandonment of any semblance of federal climate action. Americans are watching, the world is watching, and I don't think anyone is reassured. That is why this committee is taking our nation's climate response seriously, and we have proposed many policies to reduce pollution, including directing EPA to take meaningful actions under its existing authorities. And with that, I will now recognize Representative Shimkus, ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'd like to welcome everyone in our audience. I always like to recognize the students that are here observing the hearing. Thank you for being here. And also, I'll start that we had a wounded warrior in our office. He probably would be mad if I called him out, so I'm not going to mention his name, but he did get hired at Region 5. A wounded warrior is one that a program we have here to help transition those soldiers, and we were very pleased that he now is working for Region 5 up in the Chicagoland, so we want to thank you for that. Last December, the Bloomberg Environmental ran a story by David Schultz on the proposed lead and copper rule, calling it sneakily strong and pushing back on national environmental advocacy groups, suggesting that it's weak, and I have the story here. Could you speak to some of the elements of that rule that you consider especially strong, particularly the public disclosure requirements?
Absolutely, and that is one of the strengths of one of the many strengths in our proposal. Requiring the disclosure of where the lead service lines are is extremely important. I think everybody should know whether or not the water lines that serve their houses contain lead. We set a 3% replacement rate, but what we did was we got rid of all the off-ramps and all the exemptions that water companies have been able to use in the past for replacing lead service lines. In the past, you would get credit for partial replacement. We don't allow that anymore under our proposal. We also require that if a homeowner replaces their lead service lines, that the water utility must replace the line servicing the home as well. So we're going to see a lot more increased lead service lines replacements. We're also requiring in our proposal the testing of water in all schools and daycare centers. The population that is most impacted by lead in drinking water are small children. And so this has never been required before, and we will be requiring the testing of water in all schools and daycare centers, which will help reassure parents everywhere that their children are not exposed to lead in their drinking water.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Many of the same people who derided the proposed lead and copper rule also have suggested the agency cannot be trusted to, quote unquote, do the right thing when it comes to PFAS. They argue for statutory mandates on every action EPA takes on this class of chemicals. Can you tell me about the progress EPA has made under the PFAS action plan?
Absolutely, we've made a lot of progress. We proposed at MCL just last week for the two PFAS substances. We issued our groundwater guidance in December. We added 172 of the PFAS chemicals to the toxic release inventory. We also, just last week, published the SNUR, the Significant New Use Rule, to stop the importation of products that may contain PFAS. We finalized, we proposed draft toxicity assessments last year. We will finalize them this year, and we're increasing our research in this area. We increased our research request for PFAS for general research, and we also have proposed funding $5 million in research grants for agriculture communities. And just this week, we issued our EPA PFAS Action Plan Program update, and I'd like to submit this for the record as well, which outlines everything that I just covered and a lot more. We have every program office in the agency working on PFAS. So I'd like to request this be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
What can we expect to see from the agency in the next 6 months on this issue of PFAS?
In the next 6 months, we will be finalizing the toxicity assessments that we released this past fall. We'll be making progress on the TRI side as well. We're taking the next steps on the MCL. and our research. We are focusing on 4 different areas of research. First of all, the analytical methods to identify the presence of PFAS. There are over 600 different PFAS chemicals currently in commerce. We've had over 1,200 PFAS chemicals in commerce over the last 12 years, and the EU and the OECD have identified over 5,000 PFAS chemicals. You can't use the same technologies to identify all the chemicals in the drinking water. You can't use the same cleanup technologies to clean up all of them. You have long chain, short chain forms of PFAS, and it takes a lot of different scientific research and analytical methods to identify the substances, clean them up, identify which ones have the greatest environmental and human health impacts, as well as understanding how they transport and the exposure of the chemicals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back one time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Yvette Clark, who is vice chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes, please.
I thank you, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus, for convening this hearing on the President's budget proposal for the Environmental Protection Agency. And thank you, Administrator Wheeler and your colleagues, for being here to offer testimony.
Thank you.
Just this past December, the House and the Senate came together in a bipartisan fashion to approve fiscal year 2020 appropriations for the EPA, which restored our nation's critical environmental funding that Donald Trump had attempted to cut the last time we all went through this process. And yet, we find ourselves right back here again for the 4th year in a row, faced with another budget request from the White House that slashes our nation's environmental safeguards and programs. So, Administrator Wheeler, I just have a number of yes or no questions for you, starting with the area of air pollution. And I wanted to know whether you acknowledge that more than 140 million Americans now live in counties with unhealthy air quality in terms of ozone pollution and particulate pollution.
I'm not sure of the number, but I know that we have moved more areas of the country from non-attainment to attainment during the last 3 years.
Yeah, so I
than the
wanted to
previous
just
8
drill
years.
down and let you know it's 140 million Americans. Were you aware of that? Yes or no?
I'm not sure of the source of your data. I know that there are some environmental groups that put
Okay.
out numbers,
All
but
right.
we use the EPA numbers for that.
Enough said. Are you aware of the fact that climate change is leading to rising surface air temperatures that trigger greater levels of ozone pollution in cities and particulate pollution from events such as wildfires?
I know that
Yes or no?
wildfires are, some
So
people believe
are you
that it's
aware
causing
that-
wildfires, but there's also, I
You're
think,
aware
bigger
that there's a
causes of
greater level of-
wildfires, including forest
You're
management
aware
practices.
that there's a greater level of ozone pollution in cities based on, such as what? Based on
I'm not sure that there's a direct correlation between
Okay, no
climate
problem.
change and ozone.
Mr.
in
Wheeler,
cities or
do you
not.
acknowledge that pollution from fossil fuel burning vehicles and power plants directly contribute to high levels of asthma, as well as other respiratory and cardiovascular conditions, particularly among low-income families and communities of color?
I don't believe the science is settled on that because air
Okay.
pollution has
Yeah,
been reduced.
So I'm assuming
and
that,
asthma
I'm
cases
assuming
have
that's a
gone
no.
up.
I'm assuming that's a no.
That is a no.
Okay, perfect. I ask these questions, Mr. Wheeler, because these facts are critically important to understanding the big picture of how your budget and policy decisions directly impact the health and well-being of communities in my district in Brooklyn and in districts like mine across the country. Whether or not you choose to acknowledge it now, these are the facts that we face as a nation. Given that the EPA's fundamental priorities include protecting human health and clean air, I'm trying to understand why and how this budget request justifies chopping almost 50% of the current funding that goes to our national programs to improve air quality. How do you explain this?
I don't think that's accurate, and I just want to clarify for the record that all 6 criteria air pollutants have gone down under
You don't
President
re- you
Trump's
don't- you
watch.
don't acknowledge
Our air
that
is
there's been a
cleaner
50%
than it was
cut?
than it was 3 years ago.
So you're saying there's not a 50% cut?
I don't believe it's a 50% cut, no.
It is.
But again, our air pollution has gone down over the last 3 years. Our air is cleaner than it ever has been. 74% reduction in the 6 criteria air pollutants since 1970, and all 6 have gone down over the last 3 years.
One of the clean air
You're on
cuts
a
in this
great
budget
trend here.
proposal is the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, otherwise known as DERA, which is been among the most cost-effective federal environmental programs, reducing harmful emissions and improving air quality, especially throughout low-income communities and communities of color. In fact, DARA has been so successful that I used the program as a model for my recently introduced Freezer Trucks Act, which establishes a grant program under EPA to electrify diesel-powered refrigeration units on refrigerated delivery trucks. As Administrator, in the recent DARA fourth report to Congress, EPA described this program as cost-effective, targeted disproportionately affected communities, and supported by the American industry. Do you agree with this assessment?
Yes, we are very supportive of DARA, and we're continuing to use DARA grants to reduce diesel emissions. Priority is being given to projects in areas of poor air quality and also areas of highly concentrated diesel pollution, such as ports and distribution centers.
Very well. Then why does your budget propose to gut this vital program by asking for only 10% of the funds Congress has previously authorized?
We had to make a lot of hard decisions to try to get a balanced budget, and I think it's important when budgets are balanced, there's more funds available for all programs.
Understood. I simply don't understand the reasoning. At a time when our country is looking for ways to create jobs, protect the health of our communities, address climate change, DARA stands out, to me, as a prime example of what works. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. I'll now recognize the next member, but before so doing, let me just make a point of clarification. Administrator, you indicated or stated that you proposed an MCL last week for PFAS. You proposed, we believe, a regulatory determination.
Right,
We are still
determination,
potentially years away from your proposing an MCL.
Yes.
With that,
Shorthand, but yes, you're correct.
With
We
that
propose a regulatory
clarification-
determination for both substances.
thank you. With that clarification, we'll now recognize Representative McKinley for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for appearing one more time before us. It's always a delight to interact with you on it. I want to also thank you for your prompt response to my inquiries over the last few weeks about the Payton City water problem that they're having down there with trichloroethylene gotten into their water system. My question still is, and I think we're working together to try to get some temporary equipment moved in there for air strippers to do that, and we want to continue that. But I still have the question, is that if you bathe in water that's contaminated with TCE, can it be absorbed into your skin? Do you have a problem with that over the next 120 days before the equipment is the final installation of the treatment facility? Could you get back to me on that? I don't expect you to have that answer offhand.
I would not want to give a scientific answer like that offhand either.
If you
but
could,
we will get back to you.
I'd appreciate that. I want to make sure that bathing and washing in a dishwasher, that it's safe. The second question, I want to follow up on Shimkus's question that was rather interesting, that the lead in the pipelines, you've been very active. The EPA has been trying to force communities to remove the lead in the service lines. But we still have a problem with lead in our residential, because up until 1986, you were still allowed to use lead pipes in residentials and apartments. I'm curious to see whether or not, and maybe again you get back to me, which is, do we have a registry or an estimate, maybe just an estimate of the number of homes and apartments that could still contain lead? Could you get back to me on that?
I don't believe we do. We do not regulate the pipes inside the house.
I know you don't regulate, but
wouldn't
there ought to
collect
be
that
some place. If you don't have it, then maybe that's a role for Congress, that we need to have this to get a sense, because the children are spending more time in their home than they are in our schools and our daycare centers. So I'd like to understand a little bit about the dynamics of what that is. So if you could get back to me on that.
Absolutely. And one of the aspects of our proposed lead and copper rule is if the homeowner replaces the lead pipes in their home, the water system is required to also replace them, which is why we're going to get even more.
Let me move on, because I've got two other quick questions I'm trying to get to. We have a refinery in our district, Ergon. It's the last and only remaining refinery we have in West Virginia. It's a small refinery, only 23,000 barrels a year that they create. And the Fourth Circuit ruled in favor of them retaining an exemption to be treated as a boutique refinery. But it was remanded back to the EPA, and you all denied that. You again turned them down with it. Now they're appealing. They want to appeal that. But I want to put this in perspective, because Mr. Wheeler, we have 6 hospitals have closed or threatening to close. 3 have already closed. 3 more are in bankruptcies. We've had 7 coal companies go into bankruptcies. Rural America is still hurting. And here we have now the last refinery, which creates jobs in West Virginia. And if we don't get that exemption, I don't know that they have a long-term future. So I'm concerned especially since the 10th Circuit has now ruled that if you don't have an exemption, you'll never get an exemption. And they don't have the exemption right now. So is it fair? That's the operator. Is it fair, do you think, from the EPA, that if you take that nationally, that ruling, Ergon will never be able to be treated as a boutique small refinery? Keep it in mind, they have 23,000 barrels versus Marathon is one of at 300,000. This one size fits all that you're coming up with, I have a real problem with that. I'm hoping that somehow you don't, but let me hear from you. Are you open to considering giving them an exemption?
Well, I believe their issue in the past on receiving the exemption was the review by the Department of Energy that they didn't meet the financial disparity test, that they didn't.
The Fourth Circuit agreed with them. You all didn't agree with them, so I'm just asking, because I'm running out of time, that you'll rethink that again.
I'd be happy to.
This is critical to the economic vibrancy of our area. When your hospitals and mines are closing down, don't shut down our refinery. The last question that I can just keep it open real quickly with it, is there anything in this budget to help us maintain our aging coal fleet? Coal-fired power plant fleet, we know the average age is in the 45 to close to 50 years old. Is there something in there where we can address the new source review, something that might be able to sustain that so that we can maintain about a 25% mix?
It's not necessarily in the budget, but we are continuing to work on reforming the new source review program. I think in retrospect, looking back, I think you can safely say that the NSR program was weaponized to go after certain industries. And I think that's a misuse of that provision, because I think that we should always encourage any facility to add new pollution control equipment.
Thank you.
That
Time's expired. Yield back.
disincentivized adding new equipment to those plants.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Blunt Rochester for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, I want to thank you for being here today to talk about these critically important EPA programs. I'd like to first focus on the Toxics Release Inventory, or TRI, something that your budget documents refer to as, quote, the agency's premier source of data on toxic chemicals release and management, end quote. I couldn't agree more that the TRI database is an essential tool, especially for communities' right to know when there is a chemical release. Because of this, I'm concerned that you have proposed cutting the budget for TRI by a third. Mr. Wheeler, why have you proposed to drastically cut the funding for this important program?
First of all, I fully support the TRI program. When I graduated from law school, I started as a career employee at the EPA in 1991 working on the TRI program. And so we made some tough decisions, but we believe the amount of resources we've requested for the TRI program will continue the program as it is today. I'm a big supporter of the right to know concept and the TRI program overall. Again, I worked in that program for 4 years as a career employee back in the early 90s, so I fully support the program.
So you fully support it, but cut it by a third, and you're saying on the record that you believe you have the resources.
If you look historically at the number of resources that program has taken, we've gotten more efficient and more effective on running the program. We used to have a much larger staff in the 90s when it was a new program, but as things have gotten more with the use of computer reporting, the use of other groups using the data.
I just need to
Costs
move
have
on.
gotten down.
I'm working on legislation to strengthen the TRI program by requiring an annual public meeting to be held by covered facilities and following any significant toxic releases. In Delaware, we had some serious situations where we had toxic chemicals released, and the surrounding communities felt in the dark about the incident and its impact on their health. To me, this is unacceptable. Mr. Wheeler, what is the EPA doing now to require TRI-covered facilities to inform the communities on their fence line when a release occurs?
Well, the TRI program doesn't require the reporting to the local communities, but by reporting the information publicly, local community people have access to that information and data. That was the first original right-to-know legislation that was passed in the mid-'80s. So people have access, through the TRI program, the neighboring communities have access to that data, and they can access that on the EPA website and a number of other
So
organizations.
basically, you're not doing anything, they have to go out and find it?
We're putting that information out to them, to the public.
So I'm
making it
especially
publicly
concerned
available.
about the cuts because Congress just expanded the mandate of the TRI programs by requiring reporting of releases of PFAS chemicals. What is your plan to implement these new reporting requirements? And can you explain why you're not asking for additional resources? I know you mentioned, on the one hand, you mentioned the issue of efficiencies, but you also mentioned you had 1,000 vacancies as well for your organization. I'm just trying to.
We hired 1,000 people over last year. But we're also losing people. We lost around 900 people last year, and we brought on about 1,000 people. And we are having that problem. We spent a lot of time and resources 2 years ago trying to hire new risk assessors in our toxics program. And we hired 30 new risk assessors in that program. At the same time that year, we lost 30 risk assessors.
And you do have a plan to implement these new reporting requirements?
We are now looking to hire risk assessors in our Research Triangle Park facility because of the universities that are located in that area. We believe we can get recent college graduates who want to stay in that area.
I've got 1 minute,
advertised
and in this 1 minute,
hire
I'm just
people there.
very quickly gonna turn to another related requirement that was enacted the end of last year, which is the Research and Coordination Plan for Enhanced Response on Emerging Contaminants. I was the House sponsor of that piece of legislation, which requires the administrator to establish a working group to coordinate research and response on emerging contaminants. Can you tell us the status of the efforts to implement those requirements?
If I could, I want to be mindful of the time. I'd like to get back to you with written response on that. If you don't mind.
That would be great. As you know, these requirements are important, and I look forward to working with you on this to ensure that they are met. Thank you, Mr. Administrator, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Johnson for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for hosting this hearing. And Mr. Wheeler, thank you for taking the time out to be with us here today to talk about your budget. Very important stuff. I know that my colleagues are planning on discussing a number of issues with you today, but I wanted to focus on something a little more specific that matters a great deal to the folks I represent along the Ohio River, and it's an issue that we've been working on this subcommittee on energy and commerce for quite a while to find the most responsible way forward. In your testimony, Mr. Wheeler, you mentioned the EPA's PFAS action plan. It has been unfortunate to see many of my colleagues in the last several months pushing a one-size-fits-all forced legislative mandate process to address this, when it is important, in my view, that the EPA should be afforded the flexibility to use the latest scientific advancements to create rules regarding PFAS and other environmental issues. So, a few quick questions. Mr. Wheeler, your testimony mentions that the PFAS action plan is the first multimedia, multi-program national research, management, and risk communication plan to address this large class of chemicals. So for those that don't deal with this vernacular every day, what does this mean?
Not just those chemicals, but any chemicals. This is the first time the EPA has used all of our statutes and all of our program offices to work on one emerging chemical class like this. You go back in the history of the agency when there was a problem, asbestos back in the 90s and the 80s. Our toxics office worked on that. What we're doing here is taking a look, and I sat down with the heads of all of my program offices in developing this action plan, and then the work of the action plan was developed by the career staff of the agency. And I said, let's be creative, let's take a look at all of our statutes. What can we do to address this? what are the statutes, and that's why we're moving forward on 7 or 8 different statutes under the authority of the EPA to address this. We consider it a very important issue. But, you know, just to follow on something that Mr. McKinley asked me about on TCE and his water, for this water district, if we jump too far on PFAS, on the MCL, for example, we're taking resources away from potentially other contaminants that local systems need to deal with. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on where the problems are on PFAS, so that we don't just tell everybody only focus on PFAS, and we end up having chemicals that are far worse for human exposure environment that go unaddressed.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in just a second, so I'll let you expand on that. But is this, is what you just described, is this a unique collaboration between EPA's offices?
Absolutely, and other countries are looking at what we're doing because we're doing groundbreaking work here on PFAS. We have the foremost scientists in the world working on this at EPA.
Okay. What prompted the EPA to move away from traditional approaches to this kind of approach to address PFAS?
Well, I've believed that for quite some time, that we need, EPA historically has been siloed. We've had our air program, our water program, our waste program, our research program, and we've not done a good job over the years, over the last 50 years, of talking between the programs. What I'm trying to do is tear down the walls between the different silos and have a much more multimedia approach. We have a PFAS action team at the agency with senior people that participate, and I have somebody in my immediate office who chairs those meetings to make sure, and I believe they're on a weekly basis, they sit down and go over everything that's happened over the last week and what everybody is working on, so we can make sure that everybody stays on track and that we get these things done.
Okay, and now back to what you said a little bit about what's being done to ensure that this all-hands-on-deck effort on PFAS isn't distracting from important work on other environmental hazards.
Well, that is, you know, on the regulatory determination for the MCL under the Safe Drinking Water, we need to make sure that the science and the data is there before we move forward with the MCL. That's what Congress mandated in the 1996 Safe Drinking Water Act amendments. I actually worked on that legislation when I was a staffer in the Senate. And we are following the protocols and the procedures laid out in the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments of 1996 to ensure that the information is there, both the scientific data as well as the occurrence data. Does it make sense to regulate a contaminant if it only appears in 2% of the water systems in the country? Congress required us to use a cost-benefit analysis in the 96 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act because they wanted us to make sure that we were regulating the chemicals and requiring the monitoring if the chemicals were widely occurring in the water systems. So we're doing that research, we're doing that work, and we're getting that data from the water systems around the country.
Super. Well, thank you for your answers, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Soto for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to first start by correcting the record. We did pass a 2020 budget. Most people here voted for it. Not sure why there were statements made to the contrary. I do want to, for my constituents at home, go back to 2017 to figure out why and how we got here. We saw a massive tax cut for the top 1% that led to $1 trillion deficit, and yet gross domestic product hasn't even cracked 3% over the last 3 years. So this is where we find ourselves, with a 26% cut to EPA. I do want to start with a thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for the $40 million WIFIA loan to Lake Tahoe. I know we did a joint press release on that, so we appreciate that. But I am concerned about the $35 million cut to the program, so hopefully we will be able to work that out. In my district in St. Cloud, Florida, we had a water pollution issue that we've started working with your team about 10 days ago, and I've asked that EPA come in to test the water. There's a resin buildup in that area that has led to brown water in that area. So can we count on EPA to come in to test the water in St. Cloud, Florida, in District 4, since discussions have been ongoing for about 10 days now?
Yes, and I will follow up with my Region 4 regional administrator in Atlanta that oversees Florida and make sure that gets done.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. You know, my test is if I wouldn't have my family drink the water, I wouldn't expect our constituents. I'm sure you feel the same way. I did want to also talk about a recent article that came out in the Miami Herald where because sea rise is going to be more than 3 feet by 2080, the Army Corps of Engineers had to brief the Miami-Dade Commission on a 10 to 13-foot seawall that'll span from Miami-Dade County to Broward County and beyond by 2080, even in Palm Beach. So climate change is a really big deal for our state. Administrator Wheeler, can we count on you to support the Clean Future Act that we're working on diligently in this committee to get to carbon neutral by 2050? And if not, what is your plan to help us get there to save my state from going underwater?
I can't commit to supporting any legislation without going through the normal process with working through OMB. Happy to take a look at the legislation, provide some technical assistance and some comments on it, but I can't commit to supporting any particular legislative effort.
And what can you commit to today as far as tackling climate change?
Well, as I mentioned in my opening statement and the exchange with Chairman Taco, we finalized our ACE rule last summer, which will lead to 35% reduction in CO2 from the electric power sector. We're moving forward on CAFE standards, which will further reduce CO2 efforts. Methane regulations. Our food waste will also reduce methane from landfills. So we're working on a number of different fronts, following the laws that Congress has passed to address climate change and reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gases.
But what about with other sectors? Because for a while, the United States has been working on transportation and utilities, but there's everything from manufacturing to agriculture and other areas of the economy where we need an economy-wide solution. What about in some of those other areas working with your colleagues?
Well, again, we are implementing the legislation that Congress has passed, the statutes that we have, and I think what you're referring to in the bill that you mentioned a few minutes ago that addresses some of these issues is not law. We don't have the authority to do those things that you're mentioning right now. But I will point out that, and I've pointed this out when I go to the G7 environmental ministers meetings, we're reducing our CO2 greater than the other G7 members. Our CO2 emissions have fallen 14% since 2005 in this country. We are on a good track on reducing our greenhouse gases compared to other industrialized countries.
And as you
mentioned the tax bill, I will also point out, though, that the opportunity zones that's included in that tax bill have led to increased investment in those communities around the country. On the Brownfields program, 108 of our Brownfields grants last year went to opportunity zones, and that's hopefully going to spur further economic development in inner cities and rural communities around the country.
And we appreciate that, but do you think the $1 trillion deficit is putting pressure to have these kind of proposed 26% cuts?
Well, again, we are focusing on the core mission of the agency, making sure that we continue to clean up the land, the air, and water, and we believe we can do that with the budget that we've requested.
Okay. Well, we'll be working in bipartisan fashion to continue to craft the 2021 budget, and we appreciate your comments today.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the now returned ranker of the full committee, Representative
Mr.
Walden,
Chairman.
for 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, we've got a hearing, as you know, going on upstairs on first responder issues and emergency communications, so some of us are bouncing back and forth. Mr. Administrator, thanks again for being here and the work that your professional team does at the EPA day in and day out. I know I've been frustrated in a district the size of mine, a lot of rural towns trying to comply with regulations, and it seems like they get slapped down pretty hard if they have, let's say, an accidental leak I had a community years ago that, very small, I mean, we're talking a few hundred people, and they had a problem over a weekend and a little sewage discharge, and the Department of Environmental Quality, the Oregon enforcer, just hammered them. It was really frustrating to them because, meanwhile, at that time, Portland, the big city in Oregon, was dumping raw sewage into the Willamette River at multiple locations whenever it rained hard. And they had some agreement to do that, apparently. And so it really creates this frustration. Do you see that around the country? Talk to me about big urban cities. Are they cleaning up this problem? I know Washington, D.C. used to discharge into the Potomac when it would rain here. Tell me what's going on in these big cities that are dumping sewage and other pollutants into bays and estuaries and rivers.
We certainly do have a problem there, and we're taking a harder look at that in communities around the country. In particular, San Francisco has been putting 1.5 billion gallons of raw sewage into the Pacific Ocean.
How much?
1.5 billion gallons.
A year?
They've been, yes, they've
Raw
been,
sewage?
yes, they've been violating their permits, and we're taking enforcement action there to try
How
to
long
get
have they
them
been
in
doing
compliance.
that?
They've been in violation of their permits, I believe, since the 1970s. So we are taking action there. New York we're looking at that to see
New York City?
yes, there were early stages there, but we're looking at the larger cities around the country to take a look at what their permits allow and whether or not they're violating their permits.
So my little towns get threatened with, literally the mayor of this little town in Eastern Oregon told the Department of Environmental Quality, here, just take the keys. I mean, based on what they were going to do to them. We got it worked out, but it's like, you know, you got a couple hundred people and they're going to shut them down and bankrupt them. And San Francisco's dumping 1 billion gallons of raw sewage into the bay?
1.5
Sorry,
gallons.
1.5 billion gallons of raw sewage?
Into the ocean.
Well, yeah, okay.
Yes, we are, I would say the state of California is helping us with this effort. We're trying to impose a new permit on the city, and the city has objected and appealed the new permit to our Environmental Appeals Board. So right now, they are still allowed to dump the sewage that they're dumping.
Who lets them dump
while the
it?
new permit goes through the appeals process.
Can they delay that process?
Yes,
Game the
they are
system?
delaying that process.
How do they do that?
They've appealed it to our Environmental Appeals Board. So that process has to work through them before we can impose tighter limits on
What kind of timeline can that be?
We're trying to speed that up. We actually have a proposal out that we're taking comments on reforming our Environmental Appeals Board, but sometimes those cases can take months to a year or two.
On your brownfields was a big issue in this committee in the last Congress. In fact, Mr. Tonko and I worked together on modernizing the brownfields program and getting more grants out to communities. You may have talked about this while I was up at the other hearing, but what kind of success are you achieving and your team at EPA on brownfield cleanup?
We are achieving, I believe, a lot of success there. As I mentioned earlier, we of our 165 brownfields grants last year, 108 went to opportunity zones, and what I did last year was actually ask all of my regional administrators to go out and hold press conferences in the communities that received the grants instead of just putting out a press release announcing all the grants. Because when we highlight the fact that we're investing in these communities, that will hopefully encourage other people to take a second look at these communities
Right.
and invest in those communities as well. So for example, when I personally went up to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania last year to announce a brownfields grant there, we had 3 TV stations, local TV stations there covering it, and I'm hopeful that the local people in that community are going to look at that location and say, if the EPA is investing money to clean up this facility, maybe we should take a look at that same neighborhood. So I think the opportunity zones has been an incredible success, and hopefully will spur a lot more private sector investments in forgotten communities around the country.
I would tell you one of the biggest examples of my district's the old mill district in Bend, Oregon, that was an old lumber mill. It was a brownfield site. They cleaned it up, and now it is a thriving retail, recreation, incredible place right around the Deschutes River. Love to have you come out and see it sometime, and we'll get you out to Oregon. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Representative Dingell, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, in November, the EPA's acting inspector general wrote to Congress detailing, quote, open defiance, end quote, by your outgoing chief of staff with respect to an audit and an investigation. This committee, together with the Oversight and Reform and Science Committees, requested that you instruct the EPA staff to cooperate with the Inspector General. And so what I'd like to ask you today is if you can confirm that you expect all EPA staff, including leadership and political appointees, to cooperate with the Inspector General, including being available for interviews, and that you, in particular, and EPA's leadership will not obstruct these important investigations, yes or no?
Yes, and we did not.
Thank you very
We did not
much.
obstruct that investigation. My
Okay,
chief
great.
of staff met with
Great.
the
I'm
Inspector
glad you.
General over 30
glad.
times.
Excuse me, sir. I'm glad you have that expectation. Now, I and other members of this committee have requested information about your proposal to overhaul the Environmental Appeals Board, which reviews the EPA's permitting decisions. The EPA has provided some information and a briefing with political appointees, but still we have not received all of the information that were requested. And so what I want to ask you is, do you commit to making judges and career staff from the Environmental Appeals Board available to brief the committee staff and to providing us with any input received from outside stakeholders on the proposal before it was announced publicly?
I will certainly make the people in our Office of General Counsel available
So
to
that's
brief the
yes,
committee
yes.
staff.
That answers yes with respect to the general counsel?
Yes, for the General
Okay.
Counsel's office, yes.
What about the judges and career staff?
I'm not sure that's appropriate at this point.
Why not?
They're not part of the review of the board itself, but
But if they're the ones that have the information, why wouldn't you make them available?
we'd be happy to take a look at the information that you're requesting.
Okay, but if you have career staff that have information that's relevant, would you make them available?
If the information is relevant, we would make the information available, yes.
And you'd make the staff available? And it's not a trick question. If you've got a career staffer that has information that is relevant to a request that we've made, would you make them available?
If it's relevant, yes. I don't like
Okay,
to commit
then-
career
okay.
staff to have to come before Congress for briefings or hearings without making sure that they're comfortable doing so.
Well, okay,
But
so
the
if
people in
someone
the General
has
Counsel's
wait.
office who've
If
written
so-
the proposal, yes.
Wait, I've got the questioning.
All right?
If someone has information, is there a distinction in your mind as to whether they're a political appointee or a career staff? I mean, why would you make one person available and not someone else?
Well, I'm not sure that they have the relevant information that you're
Okay,
looking for.
but if they
it is
do.
relevant, yes, we'll make it available.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Shimkus and I actually worked together with a bunch of the members of this subcommittee on reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act. But unfortunately, the EPA doesn't appear to be carrying out several of its critical responsibilities under TSCA. And so I want to ask you if there's any documentation associated with any of the following EPA responsibilities. And if you can answer yes or no, that would help. And after today's hearing, where a formal policy procedure or other documentation does exist, we would like to have it. And if it doesn't exist, if you could let us know in writing why it doesn't. So here's the first question. Mr. Wheeler, the EPA recently allowed new chemicals for which it had identified risk to workers to enter into the market without restrictions. Does the EPA have a document that provides the basis for the agency's belief that this comports with the law, yes or no?
I'd have to know which chemical you're referring to.
Okay, if we get you that information, will you supplement your answer?
Yes.
Thank you. EPA is mandated to consider all known exposures to a chemical in its reviews of existing chemicals, but it's asserted discretion to ignore some exposures. Does EPA have a procedure for deciding how to exercise the purported discretion?
Yes, we do have a procedure
Okay.
that we are following.
Good. Can we get a copy of that from you in your supplement?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I understand the EPA has not required any testing of chemicals to inform the reviews of potential risks. Is there a policy at EPA for determining when to require such testing?
I will have to get back to you on the answer for that question.
Okay, thank you. I have some other questions, but I'm out of time, and so if you will work with me, we're going to submit those to you in writing, and if you could answer them, I'd
Absolutely.
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Washington State, Representative Rogers, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Administrator Wheeler for joining us today. I appreciate your focus on getting results.
Thank you.
We must have clean air and clean water for the citizens of this country. And it seems to me that you are really focused on how we're going to get results. You've been particularly helpful in working with me on issues that have a direct impact on Eastern Washington. And to that end, I'm pleased to see the biomass carbon neutrality rule that was sent to OMB this week. This is long overdue, and I just am pleased to see you pressing forward on finalizing it. We've also discussed the erroneous water quality standards that the Obama EPA imposed on Washington State that are not even attainable, are not measurable. They were imposed at the tail end of the Obama administration after the Inslee administration at the state level had spent years putting together water quality standards for the people of Washington state, bringing stakeholders together and hammering out some of the strictest standards in the country for Washington state. And yet the Obama administration said no and imposed their own standards right at the tail end. For me, representing Eastern Washington, Spokane, the city of Spokane spent hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up the Spokane River. Local businesses spent billions on state-of-the-art technology to eliminate their footprint on local rivers and lakes. The former mayor of Spokane, David Condon, was even brought to the White House by President Obama for his praise on to praise him on this water storage system, the innovation and the state-of-the-art technology that we were putting in place in the city of Spokane. Yet despite this investment and praise, these efforts still do not meet the unattainable and immeasurable standards imposed by the Obama EPA. We cannot get the permits that we need. I find it odd that the Inslee administration now, Governor Inslee, is now defending the stringent federal standard it previously opposed and is now opposing their own standard that they had negotiated. He's also devoting state resources to a study meant to advocate for removing the 4 lower Snake River dams to save the salmon. His Department of Ecology has a heavy hand on Eastern Washington, enforcing these unattainable water quality standards and threatening our dams, while at the same time seemingly ignoring the city of Seattle in King County, dumping millions of gallons of raw sewage into Puget Sound. This certainly doesn't meet any test of the water that I would want my children to be drinking. In addition, there's now fentanyl and heroin in the water, needles in Puget Sound. For too long, Governor Inslee and others have turned a blind eye to the issues in their own backyard and instead pointed the finger to Eastern Washington as the source of all their problems and how we save salmon. In fact, in 2017, after a spill that resulted in 250 million gallons of raw sewage spilling into the Sound, the Seattle Times noted, quote, "Not a single person from an environmental group or the public turned out to testify or demand action or even take notice of one of the largest local public infrastructure failures in decades." And this has been going on for decades, ladies and gentlemen. But yet nearly every week, we have to defend our dams from those who refuse to look at the science and look at the facts. The governor's focus on these unattainable water quality standards and efforts to tear out the Snake River dams are a distraction from solutions that will actually make a difference. Solutions like cleaning up Puget Sound. We could save the salmon, save the orcas, and save the 4 lower Snake River dams if we cleaned up Puget Sound. The #1 salmon for the orcas are in Puget Sound. So Administrator Wheeler, I appreciate the current EPA's effort under your leadership to revise these standards. I heard from my colleague from Oregon about City of San Francisco, $1.5 billion gallons of raw sewage. City of New York. I'd like to ask, have you looked at the City of Seattle? Have you looked at Puget Sound? What tools do you have to hold the City of Seattle and King County accountable?
First of all, Congressman, I have to agree with you. It's hard to keep track of your governor's positions on these issues. But we will be happy to look into the City of Seattle and Puget Sound. We have approved the state's criteria that the governor originally accepted, and we have approved that, and we think it is based on sound scientific judgment. But we'll be happy to take a closer look at the Puget Sound and any pollution going into that body.
I would greatly appreciate it, and my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Representative Frank Pallone, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator Wheeler, I wanted to focus on the Superfund program. About half of New Jerseyans live within 3 miles of a Superfund site, and any delay in cleaning up those sites has real consequences in terms of toxic exposure, health effects, economic concerns, et cetera. Now, I've reintroduced the Superfund Polluter Pays Act to reinstate the Superfund tax and ensure resources are available for life-saving cleanups. and reinstatement of this tax was supported in previous EPA budgets under the last administration. Let me just start out. Would your budget reinstate the Superfund tax to provide resources for cleanup? And I just ask yes or no.
No, it does not.
Okay. I've also authored legislation with my colleague, Mr. Tonko here, to use the Superfund program to incentivize climate adaptation and avoid the creation of new Superfund sites with every hurricane or flood or whatever. And that legislation, which is part of the Clean Future Act, builds on existing authority in the Superfund law to require financial assurances from polluting industries. So, Mr. Wheeler, your administration has now decided not to require financial assurances for the hard rock mining industry, the electric power industry, the petroleum and coal products manufacturing industry, and the chemical manufacturing industry. That's my understanding. Is that correct, that you don't?
That is, but when we work on the Superfund sites, we work to make sure that they can withstand stronger storms, and we have a very good track record there. When you look at the last few hurricanes, we make sure that the Superfund sites are buttoned up before the hurricane hits. We go back to test those sites.
I mean, I
afterwards.
appreciate
There's a very
that.
good track record there.
I appreciate that, but I do think you should be requiring the financial assurances because these are the four most polluting industries that are responsible for the greatest risk and the greatest cost of the Superfund program. And I just think the Superfund program is at a critical juncture. According to the AP, only 6 Superfund cleanups were completed last year, the fewest in more than 30 years. Would that be accurate?
That is not accurate at all.
Well, tell me what it is, though, quickly.
Sure. We cleaned up 27, delisted 27 sites from the Superfund National Priority List last year. The author of that article does not understand the Superfund program. That's the 6 number is referring to construction completions. And a perfect example is when we install a pump and treat equipment at a Superfund site, that counts as a construction complete. We then have to pump and treat for years.
All right, but I mean, I think
And
that
so
part of the problem
important
here.
number is the 27 that were delisted. We delisted more sites last year than any year since 2001. The author
Well,
of that
I think
article
part
does
of the
not
problem, though,
understand
is, and I want to move on because I only got 2 minutes left, but I think part of the discrepancy here is that for these ones beyond the 6, a lot of that work was done or completed under previous administration.
We've speeded up cleanup at all the sites. We've cleaned up more Superfund sites in the last 3 years than the Obama administration did in their first term.
Well, I guess my concern is I think there's a real risk that you're declaring some of these sites ready for reuse by lowering the cleanup standards. And
We have not lowered any of the cleanup standards. We're using the rods that were put in place by previous administrations. What we're doing is refocusing resources and getting the private sector to step up more to get the sites cleaned up at a faster
All right,
rate.
well, let me ask you to, I mean, you wouldn't disagree that you have the largest backlog of unfunded cleanup projects, right?
We have 34 sites currently on the backlog list. None of those are posing current public health risks.
But I mean,
We're
there are
doing
currently
important
35
investigative work at all 34 sites. What we're doing is we're taking some of the funds and putting it on sites where there is a human health risk. A perfect example.
All right,
is
but
the
I've
Colorado
got
smelter
to, I've only
site
got
in
a minute
Colorado.
left. I mean, my understanding, there are currently 35 cleanup projects at 34 sites that are shovel-ready and are waiting for funding. I mean, you wouldn't deny that we've got a lot of these where we need more funding to proceed, right?
What the agency used to do is put a little bit of money at all the sites to say that they're doing work without accomplishing anything at those sites. What we're doing is prioritizing our funding at the sites that pose a human
Well, why are you
risk.
proposing a
We're
cut of
getting those sites cleaned
why
up.
are you proposing a cut of $112 million? I mean, you could clearly use more money, and instead you're cutting back.
We are also increasing our Superfund enforcement, and we're getting
No,
more
but I
dollars
mean,
from the
let me
private
just ask you
sector to
this, because
clean up
we're
these
almost out of
sites.
time. Why are you proposing a cut of more than $112 million when you seem to imply that we could use more money? Why?
We are getting more money for the Superfund program through our enforcement actions. The Superfund
So you're saying
program
because
today
you're
is
getting
in
more
best
money
shape
from
it's
the
been in
private
2
sector, you
decades.
don't need the general funds?
What I'm saying is we're getting the work done at the
Well,
sites that need
I
the work
appreciate
done.
that, but it just doesn't make sense to cut back on the money that we could spend to clean up these sites. I mean,
Again, a perfect example is the Colorado smelter. It was going to take 12 to 14 years to get that site cleaned up.
I understand,
We're
but I just
prioritizing
think
this
that
to
it's
get
a
cleaned up in
mistake.
2 to 4 years, and this is a site
I'm not even
where
getting an
children
answer.
play
I
in
I was
dirt
just trying to find
laced
out.
with
It
lead.
seems like you're saying the reason that you've cut back on the funding is because you're getting more from the private sector, but we still have a lot sites that need to be cleaned up, so that doesn't make any sense. But in any case.
And we're getting those sites cleaned up. We've gotten more sites cleaned up, again, under this administration.
I don't
Than
agree.
the previous administration.
I don't agree, Mr. Chairman, but whatever.
The numbers are there, the facts are there, sir.
All right, well, my
They're
time is up.
indisputable.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Flores for 5 minutes, please.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator Wheeler, thank you for being here today, and I appreciate the hard work that you and your team are doing to help clean up our environment at an accelerating rate. I also want to thank you and your team for getting back to us so quickly on the impact of revised EPA arsenic standards on rural water systems in Central Texas. Moving on to my questions, as you know, states often implement multiple national air quality standards with multiple deadlines and overlapping requirements. This consumes considerable staff resources. Over the past two Congresses, we built hearing records of testimony and evidence highlighting that these uncoordinated state highlighting the uncoordinated state burdens when examining Clean Air Act. Would you agree that it's beneficial to bring more order to the process of national air quality standards reporting, especially given the recent success in reducing air emissions to record low levels in most areas of the country?
Absolutely, and we have we've moved 35 non-attainment areas to attainment over the last 3 years. So we're working with communities all around the country that have impaired air quality and making sure that the air quality is improved.
Okay, thank you. In the last hearing that we had with the EPA, you had committed to being creative in your approach to the renewable fuel standard after 2022. As you know, Republican leader Shimkus and I worked on legislation in the last Congress called the 21st Century Transportation Fuels Act to pursue a high-octane standard for liquid-fueled passenger vehicles that would create a system that maximizes fuel efficiency and reduces emissions. Has the EPA started looking at the renewable fuel standard post-2022?
Well, you know, with the recent court decisions, we're kind of busy trying to implement the recent decisions that we have in the current program. But we, of course, are looking forward as far as out to what the RFS program will look like post-2022. But we're just in the very beginning stages of that.
Okay. If the agency didn't take any action, what do you think the demand would be for biofuels? Would it be higher or lower or the same? Or is it possible
I think
to
it would
tell
be
at this point?
approximately the same. I think you'd end up having, because of the need for ethanol for octane, I think you'd end up with probably around 8.5 to 9% ethanol being used for octane purposes.
Yeah, it'd be roughly 15 billion gallons or so annually.
It depends, because we're using less and less fuel as far as get more fuel efficient.
Good point. Continuing the discussion about the RFS, while you noted in our last hearing that you don't think the EPA has statutory authority to implement a nationwide octane standard like the one that Representative Shimkus and I were proposing, I do believe that you have enough flexibility to improve some of the RFS design flaws. One of these are improvements being made to, or one of these is small refinery exemptions. While SREs don't directly solve the problems with the RFS, they still provide small refiners with a buffer from overly burdensome cost. I've read in recent reports, however, that the EPA may be planning to reduce the amount of exemptions that they will issue for small refiners. In light of this news, the RIN prices spiked unexpectedly. Can you comment on these reports and if there are any plans to reduce the amount of SREs that are issued?
Well, I'm always fearful of making very many comments and causing fluctuations in the RIN price market, but we have the 10th Circuit decision, and we are currently reviewing that along with attorneys from the Department of Justice on how to best implement that decision. And that, of course, goes to the heart of the small refinery exemption program. Sure. So we have no announcements at this point, but we are closely looking at that decision as well as the other court decisions that we've received. This has been a very litigated area of the RFS and the Clean Air Program, and we want to make sure that we comply with the 10th Circuit opinion.
Okay. In that regard, given all the difficulty that the EPA has had implementing the 2007 law, or the changes made in 2007, and all the court cases, wouldn't it be appropriate for Congress to take statutory action to fix this once and for all? to fix the RFS once and for all?
I'm not at liberty to ask for legislation on behalf of the administration.
I'm just asking your personal opinion. I'm not asking you to ask.
I'll be happy to give my personal opinion after I've left office.
Okay, that's cool enough. If rent prices continue to rise, what is the effect on jobs and energy infrastructure in Texas?
The rent prices are very complicated. There's some economists who believe that the rent prices are passed on to the consumer. It depends a lot on the company itself, whether or not they're fully integrated, whether or not they just produce and sell refined products into the marketplace. So the rent prices themselves have a very different impact based on the corporate structure of the refiners, where the obligation currently is for the RINs. So it really does varies greatly from company to company on the impact of the rent prices.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from California, Representative Matsui, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator Wheeler. Administrator Wheeler, last year before this committee, you admitted that you'd already decided to revoke California's Clean Air Act waiver while the Safe Vehicles rulemaking was ongoing. Now, here we are 1 year later, and we have seen you do exactly that in the so-called One National Program rule finalized last September. So I think we all know that whatever the Part 2 rule will look like when and if it's finalized, the fix is in, and it's against public health, against a safe climate, against consumers, and for big oil companies and their profits. Mr. Wheeler, I have a series of questions for you about Part 2 of the rule that is pending before the Office of Management and Budget. All I need is a yes or no. Is it true that the draft final rule at EPA weakens the stringency of the standards to require a 1.5% improvement per year? Yes or no?
I'm sorry.
The final draft rule, is it true that the final draft rule at EPA weakens the stringency of the standards to require a 1.5% improvement per year?
First of all, I cannot answer as to what is in the final rulemaking
So
while we're in the middle of the
you don't know
rulemaking
right now.
process.
Is it true that the draft final rule at OMB has approximately 111 sections marked text forthcoming?
I'm not sure how many. I know that we have submitted our text to OMB, and I believe NHTSA has submitted most of theirs. I'm not sure what is outstanding.
So is it true that the cost-benefit analysis at OMB shows that the rule would have a net cost to consumers?
I don't believe that's the case, no.
You don't believe that's the case? In fact, isn't it true that the draft final rule at OMB is projected to have a net negative benefit of $41.3 billion for EPA's greenhouse gas standards, a net negative benefit?
The rule is currently under interagency review, and it's subject to change, so I can't comment on what the final rule is going to
Okay,
look
it's
like.
ongoing. Okay. Is it true that the analysis in the draft final rule demonstrates that the rule would measurably contribute to more premature deaths from lung and respiratory illnesses?
Again, it's under interagency review, so any final.
Okay. Major rulemaking such as this one must include a regulatory impact analysis, which analyzes the legal, scientific, health, and economic impacts of a major rule. Is it true that no draft final regulatory impact analysis has been submitted to OMB?
I'm not sure if it's been submitted yet or not, but again, this is under interagency review.
Okay. Is it true that no draft final environmental impact statement has been submitted to OMB?
Again, I can't comment on what is currently in interagency review.
Okay. As you know, 14 states have adopted advanced clean car standards and rely on them to meet the national ambient air quality standards. Have you consulted with each of these states as part of this rulemaking? Yes or no?
We have solicited comments from all the states, and
All
we've
the
received
states?
comments, I believe, from all 14 of those states.
All of them, Okay.
I believe so. We've certainly received
So
comments from a
you
lot of states.
consulted
on
with
this.
each of these states before unilaterally ending negotiations over the standards?
Before,
Before unilaterally ending negotiations over the standards?
well, we were trying to negotiate with the state of California, and they did not,
Well, there's a difference of
counter.
opinion there.
I know there is, but there's a difference of opinion, but there can't be a difference of the facts, and they did
Well,
not submit,
Well, they've been pretty factual in what they've been doing, so.
as have we.
So, but will you commit to submit all records of EPA's and NHTSA's meetings and consultations with states on development of this rulemaking?
I believe all those meetings are a part of the docket.
They are.
Public docket.
Okay.
If it occurred during the comment notice and comment section of the
Okay.
rulemaking, yes.
I want to bring up another topic still related to air quality, a central component of EPA's mission to protect human health and environment. Mr. Wheeler, last fall you sent a letter to the California Air Resources Board, CARB, concerning the backlog of state implementation plans for maintaining compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, pending at EPA. Your letter, rather than striking a productive tone, threatened the harshest of penalties, that is, sanctioning federal highway dollars that our state counts on if California, as you put it, failed to comply. However, the letter failed to acknowledge the years of collaboration between CARB and the EPA, nor did it give any indication as to whether this noncompliance had been addressed at the regional level before being elevated to warrant a letter directly from the administrator. I want to know, and all I want is a yes or no. Did EPA headquarters work with Region 9 staff to understand the full range of facts about California's backlog SIPs before sending this letter?
We conferred with some people in Region 9, but the important thing is that since we sent the letter, the state of California has withdrawn 43 of the SIPs that were outstanding. The problem that we had was the SIPs that California had submitted to EPA could not be approved
Why not?
because they did not show attainment. You have to show attainment in order to have
Well,
them
I think the
approved.
complication is what
And
you
so
did.
when we pointed out to California, we got exactly the results we needed from that letter. California has now withdrawn 43 of the state implementation plans that did not show attainment, and they're now working to submit plans that do.
Well,
And
it
it is
seemed to me
important
that
we treat
there was-
California the same as we treated the other 49
exactly
states.
right, and I don't believe you have in many cases. So I really feel that there has to be more conversation regarding this, because there was a sense of as we were looking at it, to do this harsh penalty, so therefore forcing California to do what you wanted it to do.
Some of their outdated SIPs dated back to 1990, and they did not show attainment. We also sent letters to 25 other states.
Did they attain? Did they respond
The other
appropriately?
states?
Yes.
We've had a dialogue with the other states, and they have, I believe, have removed some of their SIPs that didn't show
Well,
attainment.
okay,
But we
well-
had a backlog of 300 SIPs, half of which were from the state of California.
Well, we've had more of a discussion with you than anyone else. Anyway, my time has expired. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan. Representative Duncan, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Wheeler, thanks for being here. Under the Trump administration, your leadership at EPA, the United States has become the #1 oil and gas producer in the world while simultaneously improving air quality and water quality. I want to thank you and the EPA's proposed rule regarding Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. As you're aware, Section 401 of the Clean Water Act gives states a responsibility to assess potential environmental impacts from infrastructure projects that affect navigable waters within their borders. States are responsible for certifying projects being permitted by the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, or FERC. Under the law, these projects must also be approved or denied by state regulators within 1 year. Recently, states have weaponized the certification process to deny permits for pipelines, hydropower projects, and export terminals for ideological and political reasons that have nothing to do with water quality. In my view, these states like New York are abusing their responsibilities under the Clean Water Act, and it's time for EPA to step up to rein them in. Further, litigating every permit and blocking pipelines and clean energy projects like hydropower is having an adverse environmental impact and is harming consumers. Instead of capitalizing on the American energy renaissance and clean-burning natural gas from places like the Bakken or the Marcellus Shale regions without the necessary transportation infrastructure, they're forced to import LNG from our adversaries. New England just had a Russian LNG tanker provide LNG to New England states. That's just hard for me to believe when we have so much natural gas here that states are bringing in natural gas from Russia. Thanks to natural gas, the United States is leading the world in emissions reductions, but consumers in some parts of the country don't have access because they can't get a pipeline built. Ironically, New York is the #1 consumer of heating oil, which is dirtier and more expensive than natural gas, but yet they're blocking natural gas pipelines because of climate change politics. We don't give enough credit to the environmental progress the United States has made as a result of the American energy renaissance. Despite the efforts by activists to block any fossil fuel-related infrastructure project, the net environmental, economic, and geopolitical benefits are undisputed. So, Administrator Wheeler, can you update us on the status of the EPA's Section 401 rulemaking?
Certainly. We intend to finalize the 401 rulemaking by this summer. And I would point out, I completely agree with you. I think the decision by the governor of New York to veto the pipeline to take LNG, natural gas, from the shale play in Pennsylvania and Ohio up to New England was the worst environmental decision by an elected official in the last 2 years. It's subjecting New England to imports of LNG from Russia. You're right, there's a Russia LNG tanker in the Boston Harbor. It was a year and a half ago. If you just, his reason for vetoing that pipeline was because of climate change. If you take a look at the carbon footprint of transporting the natural gas from the United States, Pennsylvania, Ohio, up to New England, it is far less than the carbon footprint of transporting natural gas from Russia across the ocean in tankers. It was a horrible environmental decision, and it was done under the guise of using 401 under the Clean Water Act when there was no impact on clean water, and it was done because of climate change.
Yeah, exactly. Congress has many reasons to support domestic energy production and the necessary infrastructure. Why is it so important to get the interpretation of the rule back to Congress's original intent and provide much-needed clarity so it is not weaponized to block projects? So how does this rulemaking simultaneously promote environmental stewardships while also providing the legal certainty to energy infrastructure projects?
What we do is we require this, under the Clean Water Act, and this provision actually predates the EPA, states are supposed to only use the 401 veto for clean water reasons. And they're supposed to do it in a timely fashion. So we are putting a timeline where a governor would have to veto a project within a year or less, depending on the project. And it has to be because of water quality issues, not because of climate change or unrelated water issues.
Well, I appreciate you being here. Congressman Flores talked about renewable fuel standards, and I appreciate him doing that. I've long been an advocate of reforming RFS, and I think we need to dramatically increase our domestic production. Get on my soapbox for just a second. We see the environmental left stop these type of pipeline projects that we talked about earlier. There's one being stopped right now, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, because it crosses under the Appalachian Trail, even though there's 50-something other pipelines crossing under that trail, because they don't like natural gas because it's fossil fuel. But let me tell you, natural gas has helped reduce the carbon footprint. Good stewardship starts right there in this country. Well, thank you for the work you're doing, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Dingell, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Thanks for having this hearing. And Mr. Wheeler, it's great to have you here. I know how much you love these hearings. But I got to, express concern that you're rolling back, have either weakened or rolled back 95 important environmental regulations. Some of the ones that are very close to my heart, like NEPA, clean water, endangered species, and I just have to state that worries me. But I'm going to ask you questions about two of my favorite subjects. I can't decide which to go with first. Maybe I will start with CAFE, since my colleague, Ms. Mitsui, already brought it up. I am worried. The autos are focused on deploying new technologies. In fact, more new technologies in the next 10 years versus the prior 100 years, including electrification, connected car and autonomous vehicles, requiring billions of dollars in new investments. We need those new investments to be made here in the United States. And to do that, we need certainty around these standards that support these new technologies and recognize that customers are demanding better and better fuel economy and more electric vehicle choices. It's unfortunate that that the administration has decided to choose a very uncertain path on fuel economy that's going to take years of litigation, as you well know. This year-long process has resulted in nothing more so far than litigation. It's reportedly, you say you can't comment on it, a half-baked, at best, supposed final rule at OMB. And the real thing, we have no fuel economy standards in place for 2022. The last time you testified, you agreed with me that chaos would ensue if we ended up having two different standards for the entire country. So, Ambassador Wheeler, is this still your position? Yes or no?
I think it's still better to have one national standard nationwide, and I hope that when California sees our final regulation, when it comes out, that they will agree that it is the best approach for the entire country, and they drop their separate approach.
Well,
That would be my preferred option.
I hope that EPA sees the wisdom and we can come to compromise with California, because you're not that far off. And I've sat with both sides, and someone from the other department was very surprised at how much I understood and how close the two of you were. So it's not bad for you to compromise either. Do you think that you're going to be able to meet the legal deadline by the end of March to be able to promulgate the 22 standards?
That is certainly our goal.
Okay, I'm now going to go to my other favorite subject, PFAS. We've talked a little about what you did last Friday, which quite frankly isn't a lot. It's a small step. It's a very small step. It's not getting us to...
Very important step in setting an MCL.
Well, with great deal of respect, I've been promised since I got to Congress that that standard was coming any second. When do you think that we are really going to get a final drinking water standard for PFOA and PFAS to protect the American people and our environment?
Well, first of all, I want to assure the American people that we are protecting them today. We have the health advisory of 70 parts per trillion.
It's a guideline. It isn't a requirement. And Governor Snyder's environmental task force, when he, a Republican governor, said it is probably not stringent enough. So people we don't have a drinking standard.
We have taken 12 enforcement actions around the country, and we've assisted states and local governments with over 24 enforcement actions. We're doing the foremost science on this, and the states that are making comments like that are using our science.
Well, if they're using that science...
I don't want the American public to be concerned that their drinking water is not safe.
Well, the American people should be in some communities. Michigan's testing. We have more sites than any other state because after Flint, we test. How many communities aren't testing because they don't know the dangers there?
And we are doing innovative GIS mapping, looking at the facilities that produce the chemicals, also the facilities where the chemicals were used. We're laying that on top of the water tables, and then we are proactively reaching out to communities to say, you might need to test because of the circumstances in your community. We are doing that, but we have the 70 parts per trillion health advisory. And
it's a health advisory. It's not a standard and not stringent enough. And I'm just going to, I'm out of time already, but I am going to make one point.
I'd be happy to meet with you.
I would love to, but I'll give you one more example. You talk about how you're giving people warnings or whatever. We can't eat fish in the Huron River. That fish was caught a year before it was tested. Once it was tested, we had to put out a do not fish advisory a year later. I mean, we have a crisis in this country. Water is polluted, is poison in many communities that don't know it. We need a drinking water standard. Thank you. But I do think
I'd be happy to meet with you to discuss this further.
Thank you.
I understand your
The
passion.
gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think the gentlelady's right. There is a lot of polluted water in the United States where people don't know it. But if they're dumping 1.5 billion gallons of raw sewage in the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco, do the people from San Francisco not know that?
They didn't, and in fact, there was inspections in 2015 and 2016, and I'm still trying to find out why that information was not made public. It should have been put on our public database at the time, and it was not. We're taking efforts to make sure that whenever there is violations like that the public is informed. But there were inspections completed by the EPA in both 2015 and 2016 that saw that there was a problem, and for whatever reason, that information was not made public at that time.
And how much sewage is going in the Pacific Ocean annually in San Francisco, raw sewage?
I believe it's 1.5 billion gallons of raw sewage.
I knew that. I just wanted to hear it again. Puget Sound, Seattle. Do people know how much raw sewage is being dumped into Puget Sound and what's being done about that?
That's just been brought to my attention. We are going to look into that. I don't have the numbers for that.
So if you're not aware of it, I wonder if the people in that area are aware of it.
I don't know.
I can see how some small towns, small areas and things might not know if their local lake is polluted or raises above a certain level, but it's just mind-boggling to me to think that 1.5 billion gallons of raw sewage has been dumped from San Francisco into the Pacific Ocean. And when you find out on Puget Sound the numbers, I'd like to have that too.
I'm happy to share that with you once we have that.
You highlight in your testimony the Trump administration's commitment to reworking the waters of the United States rule, and the rule finalized last month in conjunction with the Army Corps of Engineers. Meeting with constituents in my district, a significant concern under the previous administration was the waters of the U.S. rule and how it made their lives more difficult, particularly in rural areas with lakes and ponds, and everything was declared a navigable river, like the water running off your roof. Can you explain to those constituents of mine in my district how the new rule provides clarity on who has jurisdiction over what water sources?
Absolutely. We define both what is and what is not a navigable water under our new rule, and that should help clear up a lot of the information and a lot of the misinformation and confusion over the previous standards. And what we did was we followed the Supreme Court cases and the Clean Water Act to finalize a regulation that should allow homeowners, property owners to be able to stand on their property and be able to tell what the definition means for themselves.
And still be able to thrive.
Yes.
Switching gears here, recently the agency released a proposal to update the lead and copper rule for the first time in almost 30 years. In fact, if you did it after many commenters have lowered their commenters lowered their expectations for action after the Obama administration failed to propose any sort of revision. What did you succeed, or why did you succeed where others failed?
We focus a lot of time and resources at trying to come up with a lead and copper rule that moves the ball forward and gets the lead copper pipe problem solved for the Americans. We put a lot of time and resources on it. We're very creative in our approach. The require of the mapping of all the lead surface lines is going to help inform people all over the country whether or not they have a problem. If private citizens replace their lead pipes, the requirement is then that the waterworks facilities have to do so as well to the pipes leading up to their houses. It makes no sense if somebody replaced their lead pipes, but they're still getting lead water from their city water supply. And the fact that we will require for the first time ever testing of water systems in schools and daycare centers. That children are the most have the most health impacts from lead in drinking water. There's a direct correlation between lead and IQ points in development of particularly young children, toddlers. So it's very important that we test schools and daycare centers. That's never been proposed before by the federal government.
And how are they going to afford to pay? I mean, there's some very small water systems with a few hundred people or less on a water system. How in the world are they going to be able to comply, which they need to comply, everyone agrees with?
Sure. We also are trying to make available grants and opportunities for school districts and water companies around the country. We're trying to use all of our resources. We have, in addition to the WIFIA loan program and the state revolving loan funds, we also have new programs under the EPA and the WIN Acts that provide additional funding for disadvantaged communities. We're trying to access all of those different funding opportunities to help people comply with this. Of course, it's not final yet. Hopefully be finalized later this summer. And we will also do a lot of education to water systems as far as what their resources are to help them with these.
And can you tell me how many gallons of raw sewage is being dumped by San Francisco into the Pacific Ocean every year?
1.5 billion gallons.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. Administrator Wheeler, this budget for the fourth year in a row, you've attempted to eliminate funding for the San Francisco Bay Delta Geographic Program. You've also attempted to zero the Puget Sound program. The Bay Delta program was funded for fiscal year 20 for $5.9 million. Provides oversight for projects aimed at protecting and restoring water quality and ecological health throughout the Bay Delta watershed, including the approval of state policies and established water quality standards. This program has been successful. Federal-state partnership focusing on solving complex issues facing the Bay Delta. In your budget proposal, you noted that the EPA will encourage the state of California and local entities to continue making progress in restoring the San Francisco Bay from within core water programs. Can you please describe how you expect us to make substantive progress in restoring and protecting the San Francisco Bay Delta when our federal partner decides they no longer, feel obliged to participate in the process?
First of all, we will fully implement all the funding given to us by Congress for all the programs. We did have to make some hard decisions on some of these voluntary programs, particularly the voluntary geographic programs, but we have other resources at the agency's disposal. We have the state revolving loan funds, which currently has $80 billion
So you might say that
circulating.
the budget is not that meaningful.
I'm sorry, the budget is not what?
The budget proposal is not that meaningful.
No, it's very meaningful because
It's meaningful in terms of what your feelings about protecting the environment are.
We have other tools to address the issues that you're raising. We have other tools at EPA, other water programs. We have the WIFIA program for, we have given some WIFIA loans to several different communities in California as well as Washington State. We also have the State Revolving Loan Fund programs.
Okay, thanks.
The
Moving
grant
on,
programs, the WIN grant programs. So we have a lot of other resources that we can use to address the
But
same
that isn't
issues.
really what
We
my
don't have to
question
do it.
was, and thank you for that comment, though. Heavy-duty diesel trucks are associated with a number of significant adverse health effects, such as respiratory and cardiovascular damage. That's why I've been pleased to see efforts to address this issue take center stage with this committee, whether it be brought through the Clean Future Act or standalone bills like Ms. Matsui's that would reauthorize the DERA. Given the serious public health implications associated with the truck traffic in my district, we're right in the middle of I-5 and Highway 99. I was heartened by a report issued by the Manufacturers of Emission Controls Association at the beginning of the month. MECA concludes that the emission of nitrogen oxides and greenhouse gases can be simultaneously reduced, including bringing NOx emissions down to 0.02 grams per brake horsepower hour. To quote from the report, it has now been widely demonstrated that the traditional trade-offs between CO2 and NOx emissions at the tailpipe has been overcome, and reductions of both pollutions can be achieved simultaneously through the use of commercially available technology, and critically, MECA demonstrates that it is economically feasible to do so. Are you familiar with this report?
Yes, and we're working on our Cleaner Trucks initiative to reduce NOx from the heavy-duty diesel trucks. This is an effort that is not required under law. It's not required under any consent order. We are moving forward on that, and we will be, we put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking 2 months ago.
Well, thanks. So in what you're saying is that you will give serious, were you committed to giving serious consideration to settling health protective standards that drive the cost-effective technology that can reduce both NOx and CO2?
Absolutely. I announced that 1.5 years ago, and we put out advance notice of proposed rulemaking. By 2025, heavy-duty trucks will be the largest single source of NOx from the mobile sources. And so we want to make sure that we are providing tools to make sure that communities that are non-attainment can get to attainment, because it will be a huge problem in a number of locations by the middle of the next decade, or actually this decade.
Okay. When you were before the committee last year, you told me, quote, that you believe the resources we've requested through the budget will allow us to return the agencies to its core mission of protecting public health and the environment, and we have a number of different tools that we can help the state and local governments to meet that standard. That was your quote.
Yes.
I'd like to think that I have a good understanding of these numbers, but I cannot make what this budget adds up. Can you explain to me how cutting the EPA's budget by a staggering 26% can actually help you in achieving your mission, as opposed to endangering public health and safety?
Well, I think our actions speak louder than the numbers. We've accomplished a lot just over the last year. We've deleted 27 Superfund sites from the national priority list. All 6 criteria air pollutants are down. Water protection is up. So we are on the street. Our enforcement office, we've taken more, all of our criminal enforcement numbers have increased for the first time since 2011. So we have the environmental cop on the beat, we're reducing air pollution, we're improving water quality, we're cleaning up Superfund sites.
All right.
We're accomplishing it.
Administrator, I appreciate your answer. I don't necessarily agree with your numbers. Thank you, and I yield back. Now the chairman recognizes Mr. Carter, the gentleman from Georgia, for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for being here, and thank you and your staff. You have been very helpful to our district and to me personally in a number of different issues, and I want to thank you publicly for that. I wanted to start off with an issue we have in the state of Georgia, ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide, as you know, is used for the sterilization of medical devices, and we've had some problems. We've had 2 facilities in the state of Georgia in the Atlanta area that have been impacted by this. One of them I know is closed down. The other one may have closed down as well. I'm not sure, but I know one of them has. Just wanted to ask you, first of all, can you explain to me what's going on there? Because there's been a lot of hysteria, if you will, particularly from those members of the community next to those plants about what is going on.
Yes, and it is a very complicated situation. There is concern over ethylene oxide. The concern, though, and I need to constantly remind people, it's a cancer risk over 70 years. So if you're inhaling it for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the cancer risk is over 70 years. So I don't want, there's been some news articles and some press trying to make it a much more hysterical issue than it is, but it is a very serious issue, which is why we are moving forward on 2 separate rulemakings to try to address it and try to reduce the emissions from these facilities.
Can you tell me where you're at with those 2? Can you tell me where you're at with that rulemaking?
Sure. So we proposed the first rulemaking on December 19th for miscellaneous organic chemical manufacturers, and that was proposed this past December, and we did an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for sterilizers. These are companies that use these chemicals. That was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking we issued on December 5th. We went with advance notice because we don't have enough data yet to finalize, to do a proposed rule, but we're moving forward on 2 separate rulemaking efforts to try to address the emissions from these facilities. But it's also important to note that ethylene oxide is a very important sterilizer for hospital equipment. The FDA has told us that if we quit producing ethylene oxide, people will die in operating rooms within weeks.
Okay, 2 things real quick, okay, because I've got a lot here. The first thing is, are you doing anything to work with the communities, communicate to them that, you know, that there's not an immediate, immediate risk here?
Yes, we are, and we've done monitoring. We've done air quality monitoring at several of the facilities. We're looking at their data. We have a problem with not just the actual emissions, but also fugitive emissions. We've required several of the facilities to install new pollution control equipment to reduce their emissions.
Okay.
We're trying to make sure that the communities who live around these facilities are protected.
All right, to the other point that you just made about the perhaps a shortage of medical devices, of sterilized medical devices, are you addressing that as well?
Well, the FDA is involved in that, but we need to make sure that the ethylene oxide, where the chemical is being used, does not create an unsafe conditions for the people surrounding the facilities or the workers in the facilities. We want to make sure both. But we're also told by FDA that it is required in order to sterilize equipment, that there are no alternatives to ethylene oxide for some of the sterilization for medical devices and surgical equipment.
Okay, all right, real quick, let's go over a couple other things. Tier 4 engines, thank you for your help, particularly for the bar pilots, particularly for the lobstermen. That has been a tremendous help to us. We need help with it in our ag community, and I know you and I spoke about this last week, and you indicated that there was more information that you needed from the ag community. Are we getting that to you? Tell me what you need, because this is a big problem in the ag community as well.
Sure. We are reaching out to the ag community to request information. Part of the problem is the users of the equipment don't necessarily have the data. It's the manufacturers. So we're trying to reach out to the manufacturers to get more data from them on the engines.
Okay, all right, real quick, Superfund cleanups. You're familiar with the sites that we've got in the 1st Congressional District, and you're also familiar with Terry Creek in Glenn County in Brunswick, which we did not agree with the ruling of EPA in that, because you've suggested that it be enclosed and not removed. We would rather see it removed. Therefore, I am working on some legislation, the Community Cleanup Act, and I'd like to request technical assistance with that legislation from you and your staff to help me with that, because this is very important. Now, keep in mind, this is a prime retail or a prime area in this community that could be used for a number of different purposes, but the community is simply concerned about using it, for instance, to build a school on, when you're only enclosing it and not removing the material.
We'd be happy to discuss that site. I'd be happy to discuss further with you that site, and we'd be happy to provide technical assistance on your legislation.
Okay, one last thing, and that is a thank you. I know that the biomass review is at OMB now. Thank you for your work in that. I hope that you'll continue to push that so that we can get that done. And I know, again, that it's at OMB now, that you've gotten it to that point, but we need to continue on with it as well. So thank you for your assistance, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Schakowsky, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Administrator. It can never be said too many times that our environment is in crisis, and communities across the country are feeling the effect. This budget, it seems, ignores that reality and will not provide the help that our communities need. I'm a proud supporter, by the way, of the EPA Workers' Bill of Rights, and everything in this budget seems to fly in the face of it. I've worked with them many times in the city of Chicago, where we have all kinds of issues, including the high lake level. For example, when Congress passed the Lautenberg Act to reform the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, there was the hope that a strong regulatory program could restore consumer confidence and help the public trust that the products that we buy are safe. Clearly, that has not happened. It has been almost 4 years since the bill was enacted, but we have not seen really any action on dangerous chemicals. Your budget proposal would cut funding from the Toxic Risk Review and Prevention by more than 20%, including completely eliminating the endocrine disruptor program, the pollution prevention program, and the lead risk reduction program. So, Mr. Wheeler, how can you justify those cuts?
First of all, we don't, we are still requesting money, in fact, increased funding on lead reduction programs. And on endocrine disruptors, our research office still does research on endocrine disruptors. So while we are phasing out one part of what we do on endocrine disruptors,
what part are you getting rid of, and why?
Well, the important part that we're still continuing is our research in our Office of Research and Development. On the TSCA
I really
side,
would like an answer. What are you cutting from the when you eliminate the endocrine disruptor program?
I will have to get back to you on that
Okay.
part. I was focused on the research that we're doing, which is very
I hear
important.
you.
As far as TSCA is concerned, we are in line with on the existing chemicals program. We have released 7 of the 10 risk assessments for public comment. The other 3 will be forthcoming, and we intend to meet our deadline of this summer for the first 10 chemicals. And we propose the second 20 chemicals under the law, and we've met every deadline that the new TSCA law has put out for us. On the new chemicals, that has taken a little bit longer to try to transition the new chemical program before to current, but our backlog is down significantly. In fact, on the new chemical side, last year we had a backlog of 131 that we had for more than 90 days. Now we're down to 32 more than 90 days. So we have significantly addressed our backlog on the new chemicals program, but we are in line to meet all the deadlines on the existing chemicals program.
Mr. Wheeler, I was part of the Consumer Product Protection Improvement Act, which dealt with the issue of phthalates. Is it? Phthalates, yeah. Which were made to soften baby toys, and because babies would put it in their mouths, and it was considered a risk. It sounds like you are rethinking that. Where is that? Anyway, the issue of phthalates, which we were so happy to get out of baby toys, it was part of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, but it looks like you are relooking at the issue of phthalates. And why is that? There's a re-review going on.
I'm afraid I'll have to get back to you for the record on that, Congresswoman.
Okay, and when it comes to lead, I heard you saying to Congresswoman Dingell, there are literally millions of people, more than 1 million people, who are not able to drink the water. It seems to me that is a crisis wherever it occurs. And why is it that we are not focusing, and in fact, why you are reducing, if not eliminating, is that true, the lead risk reduction program?
We have asked for more funding for the lead exposure reduction through the White House Lead Exposure Reduction Initiative, which includes $10 million for lead grants, reducing lead in drinking water, $20 million, lead research by $10 million, lead testing in schools by $5 million, and school drinking fountain replacements by $5 million. So no, we are increasing our resources on the lead. In fact, for fiscal year 2021, the lead-based paint program primarily will focus on supporting firm and individual certifications and further the agency's efforts outlined in the lead action plan. And we have provided $10 million increase for the budget on lead categorical grants program to support the state-level action in addressing lead exposure.
Thank you. I'm out of time, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Next, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for being here today. I'd like to start with an easy question.
Thank you.
Would you agree that the presence of arsenic in drinking water is bad?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that water treatment systems that remove naturally occurring arsenic should be continuously monitored?
I'm not sure about continuous monitor, but we certainly need to reduce arsenic in drinking water. We need to make sure that that is occurring.
Do you believe it should be monitored?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that civil and criminal enforcement is a key tool for the EPA to protect the public's health?
Yes, and that's why enforcement numbers are up.
Good. And I'm glad that you agree. This past fall in my district, the operator of a water treatment system for a mobile home park on tribal land failed to properly maintain it, resulting in residents being exposed to drinking water contaminated with arsenic 9 times higher than the maximum contaminant level. Do you know who caught this violation?
No, I don't, but the
well, let me tell
drinking
you.
water program is delegated to the
Well, let me
state of
tell you.
California,
Let me tell
so
you
they
who
have
caught this
primacy.
let me tell you.
Sure.
EPA Region 9 staff. EPA Region 9 staff identified it and were immediately on site to issue an emergency order to the owner and begin an investigation. Shortly after, when smoke from a mulch fire at an illegal recycling center, also on tribal land, sickened students at a nearby school, senior EPA staff were in my office the following week discussing what tools were available to protect the public's health. Your compliance and enforcement staff under Regional Administrator Stoker have been responsive, thoughtful, and diligent in protecting the health and well-being of my constituents. And this is why I'm concerned about this administration's budget. Administrator Wheeler, do you know what this administration's funding request was for the Public Water System Supervision Program that helps monitor water systems for pollutants like arsenic is?
I don't have the top number off the top.
I'll tell you, the Trump administration's budget slashes the drinking water system supervision program by $38 million, a 40% cut from last year. That's correct. That's a 40% cut. Also, the Civil and Criminal Enforcement Division for environmental programs like clean water and clean air take a $15 million cut. Compliance monitoring is cut by $6 million. EPA's enforcement of waste and recycling regulations are cut by $23 million. Under this budget, the chances of my constituents drinking arsenic-laden water and breathing hazardous air increases drastically. So how does cutting programs like enforcement and monitoring improve the ability of EPA to protect my constituents' health? How does it help?
First of all, as I started with my first answer to your first question, the drinking water program is delegated to the state of California. They do far more inspections than we
Yes,
do.
but
We
there's
oversee
funding. There's
the
funding for
California
that.
inspections.
There's funding
to
for
make
that.
sure that the states are enforcing the laws. But
So
under our enforcement
let me
program,
ask you a different thing, because we're running out of time and you're not getting to the point of it, because that funding empowers that state and your regional offices to do the work. The fiscal year 21 Trump administration budget cuts the Tribal General Assistance Program and the Tribal Air Quality Programs by more than 30%. These are important programs used by tribes in my district to improve their air quality and establish environmental protections on their land that have benefits not only for their members, but for the surrounding community. But because this program is already underfunded, these cuts will make it even harder for tribes to access this funding. I'm currently in the process of working with the tribes in my district to partner with agencies like the EPA, your agency, to develop robust environmental programs to prevent, mitigate, and respond to airborne hazards. How can the EPA support tribes and tribal consortia who are aiming to establish environmental programs on their land?
first of all, we provide assistance, technical assistance to tribes and states and local communities all across the country. When we delegate a program to a state, they are responsible for taking over the inspection and assistance to the local communities within the state. But, a perfect example is our research office over the last 2 years provided 35,000 hours of technical support to states, local governments, and
So
tribes.
let's talk more about that. I'm genuinely interested. And will you commit to working to honor the government's trust responsibility and ensure the tribes are fully supported in their efforts to establish and grow tribal environmental programs with me?
Yes, I'll be happy to work with you on that.
Great. Let's have a conversation after this. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative Peters, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for being here. I'll just share with you, I also was an EPA employee when I first came out of college, so I'm not sure there's many of us who started out there, but I'm proud of my service there. Thank you. As I'm sure you know, the Tijuana River is routinely experiences millions of gallons of sewage dumped across the U.S.-Mexico border. Last year, the previous administrator for Region 9, Mike Stoker, came to Coronado, a beach community I represent in my district, told a room full of citizens and elected officials from the County of San Diego, the San Diego Regional Water Quality Control Board, the City of San Diego, Customs and Border Protection, and others, that, quote, we are 100% committed to doing everything we can to resolve this issue. And I can tell you, as are we locally committed. And since that meeting, I'm proud to say that Congress, in working with President Trump, has secured $325 million for construction of high-priority wastewater facilities along the border. And Congress will be watching to ensure that all relevant agencies are working together towards a comprehensive regional solution. Now, $25 million of that was zeroed out in the budget, but which I don't understand. But let me talk a little bit more about some of the substance around this. It's Congress's expectation that the EPA will lead and coordinate efforts to address the transboundary sewage flows in the Tijuana River Valley watershed. How does EPA view its role?
We're taking the role very seriously. There's new money available to us through the USMCA. We're actually, I believe the letter is going out either today or tomorrow, inviting the Local mayors, although most of them have already been notified ahead of time of a meeting on March 9th with our new Regional 9 and Regional Administrator, the Assistant Administrator for Water, and the Assistant Administrator for International Affairs to talk about how we're going to fund the projects to clean up the water in the Tijuana River Basin.
At the same time, we got the $300 million. The proposed budget defunds $25 million. Was there a reason for that?
Well, we have the new money through the USMCA, and we believe that that money available along with the, there's a regional bank that we sit on the board of to supply funding for projects along the border. We believe that those two funding streams this year will be able to take care of the problems on the border.
We were very encouraged by Mr. Stoker's interest in working with the locals on identifying priority projects so that now that we have this money, we'll know where the first dollar should be spent to make the greatest impact, and we'll be able to get planning on the ones that'll take longer. Have you given direction to the new administrator to continue that cooperation with locals?
Yes, absolutely. And he's already reached out to a number of the mayors and the local community leaders.
I know that
on the job 2 weeks.
I know that you would not talk about personnel matters, but I'll just let you know that one of the rumors going around about why Mr. Stoker was relieved is that he was speaking too highly of the locals or was too nice to the locals. We would hate to think that there was any truth to that.
There's no truth to that at all.
Great, okay. And can you tell me what conversations you've had with our new administrator? I think his name is John Busterud?
Yes.
Busterud, on this topic so far?
When I interviewed him for this job, I told him that had to be one of the highest priorities as regional administrator, was to try to address this problem.
Okay. Well, I can tell you it's our highest priority too, and obviously we worked very hard. We appreciate the cooperation of the administration. It's more than just a recreational or tourism issue, although those are very important to us, and tourism is a big part of our economy. It's also it's a national security issue in that the Navy can't train, the Navy SEALs can't train in water that's contaminated, and the Border Patrol can't patrol a border that's loaded with sewage. So I appreciate your committing to work with us, committing to the new administrator of Region 9 being as cooperative with locals as the previous one was, and look forward to continuing a partnership with you to solve this very important problem. I can't think of anything right now in the hemisphere that's probably as big a contamination issue as this multi-billion-dollar sewage issue that we have.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm told that he will be here in D.C., the new regional administrator, in 3 weeks. I'd be happy to set up a meeting with you.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Representative Barragan, for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, last time you were here, I raised an issue about brown water in Compton. Instead of working with my office on the issue, reaching out to us on working on the issue, you use that as your explanation about why you came after California and started to investigate California. It's pretty sad that you would use an exchange with a member of Congress to then go on and attack a state. Today you repeated those allegations about San Francisco, which is what you indicated our exchange prompted this investigation. I just, I need to on the record put on, the state senator, Scott Weiner, who represents San Francisco, has indicated that those allegations that you've made, and you've repeated here today, about billions of gallons going into of raw sewage going into the oceans, is misleading and fraudulent. Those are his words, and I'm quoting that. The mayor of San Francisco has also gone on to characterize the allegations that you've repeated here today before our committee in the same way, and has even gone on to say that the EPA recently awarded San Francisco the largest merit-based award it has under its competitive loan program for water infrastructure. And those are quotes that I'm reading in response. And so it's a sad day when the administrator comes into this committee and then uses an exchange with me to come after California and uses that although not shocking for this administration, but sad to
Congresswoman,
see you do
last
that.
year, you
Sir,
only
I am
allowed
not
me to
asking for a
answer.
comment. You have already given your comment to the media, and this was my opportunity to respond
And you didn't
at
let me
how
talk
outrageous
last year either,
it
which is
that
why
you
we
would
didn't
use
have a conversation.
this exchange.
You
You
only
did
allowed
not
me to
reach out
answer
to my
yes and
office,
no
and you did not
questions
work
last
with
year.
me. The budget that is proposed is just a furtherance of what this administration and what your agency is doing, the hypocrisy on them trying to do something. Yet here they are proposing to cut 23% in drinking water state revolving fund, which is what communities rely upon to help make sure that the water is clean, not just in my district, but across the country. Since you showed an interest in air pollution in California, in my own district in South Los Angeles, it's a non-attainment for particulate matter and ground-level ozone. Both of these are very damaging to the respiratory system of community members. Our asthma rates are twice the national average in communities that are 90% Black and Latino. Is that acceptable to you?
First of all, you didn't allow me to answer questions last year except for yes or no, or I would have explained to you that the state of California.
Sir,
has
I'm going to
delegated
reclaim my
water
time. I'm moving on to this question. I want to know if you think it's okay that average rates are twice the national average in communities that are 90% Black and Latino.
Perhaps next year you'll let me answer last year's question then.
Are you going to answer the question, sir? Okay, I'm going to assume you're going to think it's okay that in Black and Latino communities that there's a much higher rate of asthma.
Absolutely not.
Okay,
Our
well, I'm glad
programs
to
are
hear.
working
I'm
get
glad to hear you
non-attainment
say
areas
that.
to attainment.
The EPA has a targeted airshed grants programs. I'm assuming that you are familiar with these programs. It supports local clean air projects in areas facing the highest levels of ground level ozone and fine particulate matter. Is that right?
California has the highest number of outdated or non-approvable SIPs than any
Sir, I'm
other
asking about the EPA's targeted airshed grant programs from the EPA. Are they there to do that or not?
We are working with communities under a number of different programs to get from non-attainment to attainment.
Are you familiar with the EPA's
more
target
programs, more
airshed?
cities to attainment than the previous two administrations.
Okay, Mr. Wheeler, I'm going to assume you don't know about your own EPA's targeted airshed grants. Let me read you from the EPA website what it's designed to do, since you don't know as the administrator. This program will assist local, state, and/or tribal air pollution control agencies to develop plans and conduct projects to reduce air pollution in non-attainment areas that EPA determines are the top 5 most polluted areas relative to ozone, annual average, fine particulate matter, or 24-hour PM's 2.5 National Ambient Air Quality Standards. I'm reading directly from the EPA's website. So, sir, now that I've educated you on what your programs are, I'm looking at a PowerPoint slide from the EPA website as well, which I'll hold up right here. Maybe somebody on your team has it over there. You're proposing in this budget to cut, basically eliminate these targeted airshed grants programs that the EPA website uses to reduce pollution. Is that right?
Are you interested in the facts, or are you interested in just making a speech? We have other multi-purpose
Sir, I'm asking you
grants.
yes or no questions. It's clear to me.
That's what you did last year, and
You're
you didn't get the
eliminating
information you wanted.
programs that are going to air pollution.
That's what you did last year, and you didn't get the information you wanted.
Well, it's
I
clear
thought
you
you were going
didn't
to
know
follow
the
up with
answer,
written
sir.
questions for the record so I could explain to you what's going on in California last year, and you didn't even do that. So apparently you're more concerned about making a public press statement than you are about getting information.
Well, it's unfortunate you don't know about your own program.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Representative Lobsack, for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to wave on to this subcommittee today, and thank you to Administrator Wheeler for being here as well. And you might imagine what I'm going to ask you about, since I'm from Iowa, Mr. Wheeler. As you are well aware, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals recently found that EPA had exceeded its statutory authority in issuing small refinery waivers to companies who had not received waivers in the prior year. The court concluded that the agency may only extend, and that's their word, existing exemptions and cannot grant a new waiver to a company that had not consistently held one. Under this administration, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of waivers granted each year, leading to the loss, as you know, of over 4 billion gallons of biofuel demand, and forcing multiple facilities to idle production or shut down operations entirely, not to mention the effects on the farmers themselves as well. The industry is hopeful that this ruling will restore the ability of the RFS to drive demand and expand markets for renewable fuels, providing a badly needed economic boost for rural America. And we know there are a lot of reasons why rural America is suffering right now. Administrator Wheeler, Bloomberg News reported yesterday that the administration has decided to limit small refinery exemptions consistent with the 10th Circuit Court's decision. Can you confirm that for me?
I cannot. We're still in discussions with the Department of Justice trying to analyze the 10th Circuit opinion. We have no announcements at this point. I'm not sure the source of the Bloomberg story.
Can you confirm that the EPA will be applying this decision nationally and not just to the refineries under the 10th Circuit's
We are still looking at the
jurisdiction?
10th Circuit opinion. We've not made any final determinations. But I will say that President Trump is fully committed to the RFS program. He is committed to 15 billion gallons, meaning 15 billion gallons, which is why we proposed 15.8 in order to net out at 15 billion gallons, which is what was required under the law.
Okay, I have a few more questions. EPA issued exemptions to small refineries in 2013 and 2014, and 7 exemptions in 2015. Does the agency intend to consider only those 7 refineries that received a waiver in 2015 to be eligible for a continued extension?
Again, sir, we're still analyzing the court decision and trying to figure out what it means for the overall program. And
I'm not a lawyer, but I have to tell you, it's pretty obvious to me what they meant when that decision, but I'll take that as
I
your
am a
answer
lawyer,
at this
but I
point.
still have to defer to the Department of Justice and my own general counsel before we make decisions.
So does the agency intend to provide new guidance based on the court decision? And if so, when can we expect that?
We will, and hopefully very shortly.
Okay, thank you. Another significant issue is, of course, the lack of transparency that we have regarding the small refinery waiver program. And while I understand that not all the information submitted by a refiner should be publicly released, the name of the refinery, I think, should be. How does EPA intend to make its decision on these waiver petitions more transparent going forward? And specifically, would EPA support making the names and locations of refineries seeking an exemption publicly available?
Well, it depends on what the companies claim as far as confidential business information. Sometimes the name of the company is legitimately considered confidential business information. What we have done is put all the information that we do receive on a rolling basis on our website to try to provide more transparency to the program.
Well, I'm a little concerned. That sounds like you're going to leave it up to the company to make that decision then.
Companies, there was a Supreme Court decision on CBI data that just came out a year and a half ago instructing federal agencies to take CBI claims seriously and to honor those claims.
Okay.
So we have multiple court decisions that we're trying to implement here.
Well, and as you know, the excessive use of the small refinery waiver over the past 3 years has been incredibly harmful to Iowa farmers across the country, especially corn growers, especially soybean producers as well, biofuel producers, the rural communities more generally. The trade issues, of course, have complicated things as well. Farmers really don't want bailouts. They really want markets, and they want to be able to produce biofuels and sell those here domestically. I am pleased with the findings of the 10th Circuit Court, which upheld the integrity of the RFS, and I strongly encourage you folks to make sure that you accept that decision, that you apply it nationally going forward. You won't be, folks here won't be seeing me after the next 9 or 10 months. I'm retiring, but I can guarantee you that whoever takes my place is going to be at least as much of a bulldog on this as I am. We'll see who the next president is, what the next administration says, but in the end, I think the people of Iowa, the people of the Midwest, these corn growers and soybean producers, on a bipartisan basis, are going to continue to press as hard as we can on this issue. We won't be letting up. Thank you.
A lot of things change through politics, but I think one thing that's absolutely steady is the Iowa delegation supporting ethanol.
On a bipartisan basis.
Thank
you, Mr. Administrator. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the very patient representative from Massachusetts, Representative Kennedy, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for convening this hearing. Mr. Wheeler, thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience as well, and thank you for letting me wave on. Mr. Wheeler, earlier this week, I sent you a letter regarding a planned EPA project to bury thousands of barrels of toxic and radioactive waste less than a mile from one of the world's richest fishing grounds in Boston Harbor. I don't expect you to be intimately familiar with this project, and we just sent you the letter a little while ago. But there is concern back home in Massachusetts about what could come with the burying of these materials that are already there, now covering it with tons and millions of tons of additional sediment. And the worst case scenario involves that toxic hazardous waste leaking into the water under the weight of, as I said, millions of tons of rock-filled sediment, immediately jeopardizing the survival of nearby fishing stock, and a number of endangered species that are right up against the site is actually up against the marine sanctuary. So all I'm asking you, at least for this part, is will you commit to working with our office and the regional EPA office to put in place a plan to mitigate what could become a worst-case scenario?
Yes, it's my understanding my Region 1 staff is already engaged with your office, and that we have a meeting scheduled soon between our staff and your office, and we'll be happy to work with you on that, and we're working with the Army Corps on this side as well.
You are, and they have responded. I appreciate that. It's, again, given the nature of the conditions there, a concern, and again, for the record, that waste was there long before, for a long time. Maybe. Thank you. Maybe. but for a long time.
Before I was born, too.
Okay. Second, another local concern. There's, I think, unambiguous evidence from epidemiology and environmental literature that ultrafine particles, also known as UFPs, are a very dangerous component of air pollution. They do remain unregulated because they are too small to be captured in the mass-based PM 2.5 standards. The Clean Air Act mandates setting health-based standards with no requirement that technology exists for either the monitoring or regulation of the pollutant. So we're wondering why the EPA hasn't moved toward establishing air quality standards for UFPs to protect the health of tens of millions of Americans that live in high UFP areas, like right next to roadways and airports.
We are updating the PM NACs this year. It will be finalized by the end of this year, and that is certainly a research question that we have. We have a lot more questions than answers on that. But the way the NACs process works, we update each one every 5 years, and after we're finished updating the PM standards this year, we will start the next 5-year review the very next day. But we're taking a look at that science as it comes in, but there's still a lot more unanswered questions on not only the impact, but also how you would control it, how you would measure it. As you mentioned, the monitors don't pick that up. We're getting to the point in our environmental protection, particularly on the clean air side, where detection or public health impacts on people are getting us closer and closer to what is naturally found at background levels. The science has expanded so much over the last 30 years.
And sorry, I appreciate that. One of the challenges that we confront, we've been working with researchers, some researchers in East Boston that are looking at UFPs as the pollutant coming in from landings at Logan Airport. I appreciate there's research. I also appreciate understand that from your answer there could be years and years before this is
hopefully
done.
Not years and years, but we don't have the science yet for that.
And I'd also couple that with some of the communities here are environmental justice communities. There's a 71% proposed cut to that office under EPA, which I would hope.
Well, actually, our administration, we moved the environmental justice office out of our enforcement office and put it in the administrator's office to try to bring more prominence to environmental justice across the agency. And we're putting environmental justice in all of our programs. And perfect example is our Brownfields program, where we are focusing in particular on opportunity zones, which goes to the heart of environmental justice. In this way, 108 of our Brownfields grants last year went to opportunity zones, both inner cities and rural communities.
Okay, well, I look forward to working with your office on the implementation of that, because I've got a bit more concern about how that is being defined, and opportunity zones are, I think we've seen the impact of those economically actually vary quite a bit depending on the project. There's communities like Revere, Everett, Chelsea in Boston that are begging for the attention that is necessary to lay off some of the contamination that has been put in place now for an awfully long time. And we'd be looking for some assistance to make sure that those voices are heard. And time's up, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I believe that concludes the list of colleagues who, members who wanted to question our witness. Let me now move to requesting unanimous consent to enter the following into the record. We have a letter from the American Public Works Association, a letter from EPA to John Kim, Director of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, a letter from EPA to Catherine McCabe, Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, a letter from EPA to Basil Seagos, Commissioner of the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, a letter from EPA to Richard Whitman, Director of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, an article published in Bloomberg Environment entitled EPA Lead Proposal Derided as Weak May Be Sneakily Strong, EPA's PFAS Action Plan Program Update, and finally EPA's 2019 Year in Review. I ask for unanimous consent to enter these into the record. Without objection, so ordered. And again, my thanks to Administrator Wheeler, the thanks of the subcommittee to him for joining us for today's hearing. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days by which to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witness. Administrator Wheeler, I ask that you respond promptly, please, to any such questions that you may receive. And at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.